feed on, Ali? Great, okay, and we're recording. Great. Good evening, everybody. Could the committee please take their seats? Thank you. Okay, we are recording on the webcast. Okay, and for those people who are looking in on the webcast, and for the people in the public gallery, my name is Councillor Stuart Frost, and I'm the chair of this economic planning and housing meeting. Okay, what I'd like to say is that to my left or your right, okay, and also your left and my right here, we have officers on this side, okay, and we have the committee on this side here. Okay, there are no fire alarms tonight. Okay, so if you hear a fire alarm going off, what I'd like to do is to evacuate the building immediately. The fire exit is at the end of this room, through those doors there, down the stairs, and we will meet in the War Memorial Park. Okay. Sorry, members. I've just been it's just been commented that the picture was blurry on the webcast, so I was just requested to turn my microphone off and then back on again. Okay. I don't know what it's done, but you know, there we go. Obviously, IT rules. Okay. Right. Okay. So, members, please note that this meeting is being webcast live on the internet, and could all members please turn off your phones, okay, or ensure they're moved to silent. Okay, and I'll just do that myself. Okay, that's great. Okay, so moving on, okay, to the paper tonight, okay, and the agenda. I haven't received any apologies for absence and substitutions. Okay, so the committee is as we are. Okay, number 2, are there any declarations of interest? No? Okay, so that's good there. I've been assured that there are no urgent matters. Okay, so we can move on. Okay, the minutes of the meeting held on the 18th of July, okay, they will be approved at a future meeting of the committee. They are not ready. Okay, so we'll move on. So what I would like to point out to members that we have a full agenda ahead of us tonight, and I want to ensure that we actually get through the work by the end of the evening in the time allocated. To this end, I'll be taking the water cycle paper section by section, and I'll be asking Mr. George, okay, at the end, okay, to present to the committee in section 5. I will not allow questions during the presentation, but have allocated a short amount of time afterwards for questions of clarification only. To ensure that each member is given an opportunity to comment, I will not be taking questions from speakers in the public forum, and I'll be restricting members to 1 question / comment per section. Okay, questions and comments need to be short, concise and fact-based with no repetition, or I'll move on to the next member. Questions also must not be leading and must not be multiple questions. If a supplementary question is required, then I want members to ask for one, which will be granted only if time allows. Okay, so on to the section number 5 and the water cycle study. Okay, I'd like to pass over to Ruth for a very quick introduction on the paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, EPH. So we had a session on the 18th of July where ACOM came in and presented the water cycle study, and at that meeting there was a decision taken that it would benefit from a second meeting in relation to the water cycle study, and that's the paper that we have before us tonight, which has been requested. So the paper tonight includes in it the summary of the conclusions that were in the water cycle study. It also provides an update for you all in relation to the letter that has also since been issued from Joanna Averley, basically the chief planner for the government, which also details some of the proposals she's suggesting in relation to DLUC Bill. Also attached to your agenda We did have some questions from members that we provided written responses from, and also comments from Dave George, which we've also included in that, with some commentary as well. We also have attached some synopsis from Dave George, who's going to be who'll be presenting to you all as well as part of this evening. So I think the report in itself is self-explanatory. What we've also received this afternoon as members of EPH and officers is a collection of letters from a number of organisations asking for a test-specific policy. So we've received letters via the Whitchurch Conservation Group, from Wessex Rivers Trust, Chalk Streams Restoration Strategy, Test and Itchen Association, Wild Trout Trust, Wild Fish, the Piscatorials, Wildlife and Countryside Link, and CPRE Hampshire. So those letters have also all been distributed to you all as members, supporting a specific test policy. Chair, there's really nothing more to add. We've had the detailed session on the 18th of July with ACOM, and now it's just over to this agenda and listening and hearing what the members, have to say in relation to the water cycle study.
Thank you, Ruth. Okay, so we've obviously all read the papers, okay, and just looking at section by section, section 1, I'm assuming that after people's or people listening to Ruth's comments, okay, does anybody have any comments regarding the executive summary? Councillor James.
George had made that were in the paper, which is Appendix 1. I thought there was some concern that they didn't reflect his comments. I just want to clarify. Is George happy with those? Do they reflect George's comments, Dave George's comments, that they are what were made and that you're happy for them? Or do we need to amend those comments?
I think that Mr. George will start off his presentation by taking those and letting us know what his views are on those questions. Okay.
Well, thank you very much, Laura. Basically, yes, I think certainly the questions when they were basically came in with the documentation for this meeting were a surprise to me. I think that's the first thing, because I hadn't actually asked any questions, but I think the questions that were put down were probably paraphrasing things that I'd actually said in the emails and what have you. So I didn't actually formally submit any questions. However, I think the exercise was valuable in that it certainly did, give the opportunity here for the officers to actually comment on those. I did send responses to those because, I hadn't actually seen the questions or the responses before then, and but they weren't included within the documentation. But I've subsequently, I think, circulated them to you all after speaking to Stuart Frost. Is that correct? Have you all seen them? Yes. Okay. So I think, frankly, the responses I've given, as long as you've seen all of those, clarify where I stand on that. But certainly they weren't questions which I posed. But
thank you. Okay. Councillor Cubitt.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. In relation to the executive summary, I just want it on record that a number of expert submissions have stated that the water cycle study does not meet the statement in executive summary 1.1, whereby it evaluates how it can accommodate the growth in certain areas. So what the water cycle study does is merely say, we can accommodate growth per se, provided permits are changed and provided infrastructure is invested in by the water companies. It does not identify which sites can be accommodated. It does not identify what infrastructure is required, and therefore I believe that the executive summary on the basis of expert submissions that have been sent to us is in fact guided and doesn't state the true state of affairs.
Thank you very much, Councillor Cubitt. Is there? No, please, no. Okay, you've made your comments, please. Okay. Has anybody else got any comments, okay, regarding the executive summary?
Yeah, apart from the fact that I like the minutes.
Thank you, Councillor Cubitt. I will ask you, please, just to, please try and restrict yourself just to the one, okay, comment. You could have put it in on there, okay, but that's fine. Okay, Councillor Tomlin.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just conscious that we had a presentation by ACOM about the water cycle study, and it was a presentation where we were able to question the presenters, but we had no debate. And what I see in front of us tonight is a slightly different paragraph situation which has some of the actual detail that was presented by way of summary. So if it's not in there and the points we've got, we can't raise them from what you've just said because we're only talking about what's written in front of us. So we've not had the opportunity to have actually had a debate about the things we learnt generally from the water cycle study. So that's my comment.
I think this is your opportunity now to actually turn around and say your comments. So, if you do have any comments, as long as you can fit them into the various sections, then please, okay, make them known. Okay. Has anybody else got any comments regarding section 1? No? Okay. So let's move on to section 2. Okay, the background. Does anybody have any comments regarding section 2? Councillor Cubitt, please.
I'd like on record for it to be stated that I do not believe that the water cycle study is fit for purpose, and it doesn't focus on the spatial growth and the projected sites that are being considered.
Thank you very much. Okay, has anybody else got any more comments? Okay, anybody else at all? Okay, certainly Councillor McCormick, please.
I've got some concerns on the water cycle study, but it's more a case of when we're looking at things like water companies have a legal duty to do things when, like, not have raw sewage discharge into our rivers, for instance. They're clearly failing in that at the moment, and that's been given national recognition. What could we, as a council, do about that? Because we've had massive number of representations from members of the public on this. It's clearly a cause of concern for them.
Thank you very much. Does anybody else have any more comments? Councillor Rattigan.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just, to Councillor Cubitt's point, is there, for large sites, possibly a requirement to have a water cycle study at the planning point? If we were like South Mannydown, it's not happening yet, but would there be a requirement to have a water cycle study at a future date on those large sites? Maybe Ruth could answer that question.
Certainly, Ruth.
Okay, so we'll just clarifying a couple of things which are probably worthwhile being really clear on. The water cycle study doesn't address the issues in relation to sites because we don't have short-listed sites, nor do we know which sites will actually end up being the sites in the final local plan or the spatial strategy. In terms of development applications in the future and environmental impact assessments, issues of water cycle can be addressed and included as part of EIA matters. And in terms of, I think what you're really also talking about is supply of water and water capacity or provision of potable water supply. Those are matters which, as part of the preparing an application, and an applicant would need to work through those as well. So more than likely they'll be included in the environmental statement. So, yeah.
Thank you, Councillor Rattigan. You have actually had your one question. Sorry? Okay. Councillor Conesco, please.
Right. Thank you, Chair. It's, I guess, a question to Ruth and to the portfolio holder, really. We've been told that this is a iterative process in terms of the development of the local plan, and so I understand the point that we haven't looked at any specific sites within the water cycle study at the moment because no sites have been selected. But given the iterative nature of this, does that mean that there will be, once we have selected the sites, and we've got a conversation happening about that on Monday, does that mean we'll go back to the water cycle study, look at that again specifically with those sites and see if they're achievable? Because if not, that sort of takes away the iterative element that we've discussed all along.
We wouldn't be updating the actual water cycle study in the way that we update, for example, a transport assessment, which we had the presentation for on the same night, when we actually will have an iterative process with the TA. It's slightly different in that your shortlisted sites will lead to us working with developers and proponents in relation to what the mitigation is needed or the site solutions that are specific to those sites, because individual allocations may have different solutions. So we don't work in the sense of actually having a further iteration on the water cycle study. We actually work with the developers, the Environment Agency, and the water companies in relation to those specific sites. Depending on where they are, the spatial requirements for the various sites will be different. You have to bear in mind that we don't have an agreed spatial strategy to be consulting the water companies on at the moment. And that would be something that we'd be doing through the Regulation 18 consultation. So in a way, you're asking us to have the answers to questions which we haven't yet consulted on.
Thank you. Does anybody else have any more questions? Councillor Tomlin, please.
Thank you, Chair. Well, building on that one, I mean, we are on Monday, I've lost the plot. On Monday, we are being asked to look at certain sites. Now, we want the site evaluation, we have them in front of us, and if they're not fully evaluated, how can we actually, it's a sort of chicken and egg, how can we actually do the promotion of a site when we don't know some of these issues? And we're not talking about transport, but it links to transport, it looks at infrastructure, etc. For instance, if we have a site in Bramley, in the Bramley ward, we know from Thames Water that they haven't the capacity to get the sewage to the treatment works. Now, it's evidence, it's black and white evidence, but it's not written in anywhere. If we knew that, we might not promote a particular site. So we're premature yet again because we haven't got all the facts in front of us, and actually we have a big glaring fact called the water cycle study, which has highlighted lots of issues that perhaps we were unaware of until this time. So I agree with Councillor Konechko that we're sort of compromised, basically, without the full information. Thank you.
Thank you. Any more questions? Councillor McIntyre, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So my question is on the whether or not the water cycle study addresses the hypothetical position we're in, where the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill has an impact on our planning ability to meet those nutrient neutrality targets. Now, I know David George has a section of that in his slide deck, but I just want to understand from the officers, what impact does that have on our local plan update process if this now changes and there's further planning restrictions imposed upon us? Thank you.
Anne?
Thank you. The water cycle study acknowledged that there was the issue regarding nutrient neutrality. Obviously, at the time that it was looked at, we hadn't had the announcement or the letter suggesting a tabling amendment to LERB. I mean, that's good news in terms of it tightening controls at the wastewater treatment works, in terms of reducing mitigation and giving some assurance that there will be a solution to the issues and that it's an interim situation. So that's good news in terms of both for the River Tess and the groundwater and for the protected sites in the Solent, because it addresses it more at source and doesn't mean that developers have to provide the full mitigation for it.
Thank you. Okay, Councillor Laura James, please.
Thank you. In relation to the environmental impact assessments, after they're actually have been adopted, surely
Once that's happened, for a developer, then the reality is it's too late in relation to what we've done, and so I wonder what we're going to do about that. You're talking about impact assessments as if they're going to be the saviour here, in relation to the development has already started and it's been shown that there's a principle in relation to development.
Ruth?
Okay, the answer that Councillor Rattigan asked was specifically in relation to development management. We have to bear in mind that what you're looking at here is the water cycle study and the preparation of a draft local plan. So the EIA issues in relation to those future applications really aren't things that you need to be concerning yourself about in relation to tonight, because the point that you're making, Councillor James, is that we will actually, hopefully, because we aren't promoting the sites, we're preparing a draft local plan which will have proposed allocations in it that the developers will have to be working through the solutions and mitigations for those sites. And those, the process and the work that they will have to do will have to enhance our knowledge in relation to those shortlisted sites for inclusion in the local plan. We don't do their development work for them in terms of the preparation of how it is that they're going to mitigate their impacts, but we will actually be getting the certainty around what can or cannot be achieved on those sites through the further steps that happen after Reg 18. You cannot at this stage in the planning policy process have the certainty on the solutions, because for that further work to be done, they need to really be on the shortlisted sites, just not all of the sites. I appreciate the comments that Councillor Tomlins also made, that you're being put in a position where you're being asked to consider sites without all of the information. And yes, that's true, but you're not being asked to endorse sites. No, you're not being asked to approve sites. All you're being asked to do is to comment on sites. So the water cycle study at this stage is to help inform, the evidence base for the preparation of the local plan. And, you've got proposals in, letters, you've got proposed draft policies in relation to, water quality. And, you've also got suggestions here as well tonight around a specific test policy. Those are the things that we need to be looking at this stage in the process, and allow further information to be prepared. The reason I say this is that some sites might have specific solutions for them depending on their size. Some sites may not. Some sites there might be capacity, there may not, because there's a spatial differentiation in the infrastructure as well. All of that work follows on between Reg 18 and 19.
Thank you very much. Councillor Cubitt, please.
Yeah, I'd like to ask a question of Anne Greaves, please, and I'd like just to comment on that answer from Ruth as well. Anne, on what basis is the Scrutiny Committee, under the Constitution, run so strictly, whereby we're only allowed to ask one question. And I think it's absolutely disgusting. I think it's an offence to democracy. And I've about had it with this administration, because the contempt that they have for us, who have been elected by the residents, is really, really making me very upset.
Thank you, Councillor Cubitt.
I'd refer you to Rule 16 of the Scrutiny rules. So committees can ask people to attend, give evidence, answer questions about any items on the agendas, and meetings should be conducted in accordance with the principles, that the business is conducted fairly and that all members of the committee be given the opportunity to ask questions of the attendees and to contribute and speak, and those attending the committee by giving evidence should be treated with respect and courtesy, and that the business to be conducted efficiently as possible. So I would say that is in the discretion of the chair to work out the timings for various items on the agenda, and if there is spare time, then he can come back and allow a further question.
So I would like to make a formal complaint, because I think the chairman has demonstrated contempt for the elected representatives. I represent 8,000 people. All of my colleagues do here, and I think that his discretion is being abused, and he is abusing his power. And were I the chair, I would have no intent whatsoever to establish the rules that he has established at the beginning of this meeting. I find wholly unacceptable. That's the first thing. Second thing is Ruth Ormana just made a comment about when we choose the sites, then we can identify the solutions. And the problem is, as I said at the beginning, in relation to the background summary and in relation to the second thing that I was allowed to have just one question on with the background, is that, and the point that I was making with regards to the water cycle study, is that we haven't required ACOM to evaluate what solutions need to be required, and we haven't required of ACOM to identify the permits, because we are leaving that to the water company. So the solutions are never found or sought or identified, because the statutory obligation is under the water provider or the sewage person to identify the solutions. So whilst it's very nice to hear from Ruth, the head of planning, that we will be given those solutions, I don't recall in the 15 years that I've been a councillor, when we've had significant planning applications, that any solutions have been offered up by the water providers, because all the water providers can say, under the current government regulations, is that the answer has to be yes. They don't have to require demonstration of the technical solutions they have to provide, and they don't have to do anything in terms of proving that they provided it. They just have to answer the question yes.
Right, let's move on.
Thank you, Councillor Cubitt. Let's move on. Okay.
Can an expert here please confirm whether I'm right or not, please, Mr. Chairman?
Not at this particular time. I want to move on so we can actually ensure that we get all the business done in a timely fashion tonight. Councillor James, please. Councillor James, please refrain. Okay. The point is that the experts aren't here. Okay, the experts were ACOM. Okay, they were here on the 18th. Okay, just hold on, please, and let me finish. I've done you the courtesy of allowing you to finish, so please let me. Okay, so it's very simple that the experts are not here. Okay, they were here in June. Okay, when we had the presentation from ACOM. Okay, there were lots of questions there. You were given the ability to actually write in questions, okay, and I know a number of people did. And since then, okay, you've also had the ability and the opportunity of asking questions of officers, okay, which I know that some people in this committee have taken advantage of, Councillor Cubitt, for example, okay, but I know other people haven't. Okay, so I think there's been plenty of opportunity to actually question experts, okay, and we need to get through the work tonight, which is why I said one question per section. Thank you. So, moving on. Let's move on to section 4, please. Does anybody have any recommendations on section 4? Sorry, I beg your pardon, section 3. Okay, so I saw Councillor McCormack first, then Councillor Watts.
Thank you, Chair. Section 3.6 on page 8. I think that gets to the nub of it, really. with regards to water supply, South East Water and Southern Water both saying that they are confident that adequate water supplies will be available up to 2039 and will cater for proposed levels of growth. I'm tempted to say they would say that, wouldn't they? I have concerns. I noticed in the Gazette this week that Councillor Harvey, present in the chamber here today, had made mention of his concerns about water supply in future. Actually, what I recall the meeting was I made that point, and it pays to do your homework. The reason why I made that point is in this reference I got here from the New Scientist about the worst drought in 500 years that we just had across Europe. And it's a drought that we've only seen once before in 1976 in the last 50 years. But it would be naive of any of us, be it councillors or MPs or scientific experts, to think that we've just had the worst drought in 500 years, we won't have another one for another 500 years. There's climate change. That is going to introduce stresses, additional stresses over and above our already stressed area for water, and that's established fact that the southeast of England and this area in particular is stressed. So we're going to have additional stresses, additional demands for agricultural use, which I mentioned and is mentioned in Appendix 1, and that was outside the purview of the experts and analysis in the water cycle study, which is cause for concern. So what I would like is to simply have a reassurance that we will have adequate water supply up to and including 2039, taking into account climate change. And the study could not have taken into account what's just happened. It was made before we had this drought. So I have real concerns, and I would take advice from anyone in this room as to how we as a council move forward on this and make sure that we don't make a ghastly mistake of allowing additional houses and industrial units and have increased agriculture use for water, and we do get to the point where the system breaks down. Now, there are alternative solutions, and I think Councillor Reid alluded to that on the 18th. Hampshire are looking at providing reservoirs. There is the possibility that they'll have a reservoir in the south of Hampshire and a reservoir in the north of Hampshire. The reservoir in the north of Hampshire could quite well end up, well, more likely to end up in Basingstoke-Dean. Be careful what you wish for when making a really plaintive plea about over-demand for water, because that will prompt the water companies to go to the government and end up having a question of who wants a reservoir and where, and that will just ignite, inflame public opinion. You know, I wouldn't want to see Bramley underwater, for instance, but you know, it could well be that we have an unwelcome addition. The other option, the more expensive option, but the option that I would prefer to see happening, is if we had seawater desalination. We're close to Solent. That's technically feasible, although we are above a watershed from Winchester. The only thing that really pains me to report to the committee is that our only desalination plant in the UK, in the Thames Estuary, is currently broken down, pending maintenance, and won't be open again for another year. So I think it's probably worth us noting that there are alternatives. There may be unpalatable alternatives to groundwater extraction, but I think the absolute key requirement is that we have a resilient plan that takes into account the likely additional stresses on our existing water supply, especially in the test basin, where we had on TV news as part of this drought requests to extract increased amounts from the rivers, and the likely impact that's going to have on wild trout and all the other fish that swim in these rivers and the fragile ecosystems. So I'm really quite concerned that when we have a statement from the likes of South East Water and Southern Water, do we just take it at face value, or do we ask for more detailed information to be recorded as to what their plans actually are, and at what point they would think about building reservoirs, and at what point they would think about seawater extraction and desalination? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor McCormack. I'd like to bring in Anne, please.
I can respond briefly on that one. As you're aware, the water companies prepare water resource management plans which look at these. Southern Water, as we know, because of the restriction on abstraction, have had to look at alternatives. They have been looking at desalination, and they were progressing that, but I understand that that's been abandoned and they're now looking at wastewater recycling. I think there was quite a lot of resistance to the desalination in South Hampshire, and there were environmental issues, and on that basis they're not progressing that one. But I'm not sure how long that's for and whether that will still be an option. I understand that they're consulting on their next water resource management plan probably later this year, and that's probably an opportunity for us to throw into the mix that any suggestions. But I know that they do start by considering a wide range of options, and they do consult on that, and there is quite a lot of information on it. That is the means that those alternative water supply issues are looked at through that process.
Thank you. Okay, so moving on to Councillor Watts, please.
Thank you, Chair. In the report it says that Overton, Whitchurch and Oakley are at full capacity, but to mitigate that we're going to issue more permits in the future. Why would we want to issue more permits when the permits aren't working at the moment? We have Southern Water just flouting it at the moment. They've just been fined 100 million, and I just don't see how we can have a water strategy where we're just going to issue more permits when it's not actually working at the moment. And I would like to know which area is the Popham going to feed into? Is it going to feed into the Overton, Whitchurch area, which is already at full capacity? I'll try to get two questions in one then.
Thank you for your apology. Okay, Anne?
It's the Environment Agency's role to review permits and whether they need tightening, or whether the wastewater treatment wastewater providers need to apply for new permits. As you're aware, Southern Water were heavily fined along with others. But my understanding is that there's going to be stricter controls on that, and there is the fining mechanism, and the drainage and wastewater management plans seek to address, to ensure that there is compliance with those permit controls. In terms of Popham, it's obviously some distance away from any wastewater treatment work. For the purposes of the water cycle study, there was some discussion, and it was considered that probably the most appropriate be Whitchurch. But that's quite a good example of, although that's how the water cycle study considered it, and obviously there have been issues flagged up with capacity at Whitchurch and there needing to be improvement. So that's quite a good example of where there could be alternative solutions, because the promoters have indicated that they're looking at options. One of them maybe being providing a treatment plant on site, so it would just deal with Popham's wastewater, so it wouldn't go to Whitchurch. But for the sort of worst case scenario, the water cycle study looked at and assumed that Popham would go to Whitchurch, and was looking to see if there was a solution and what measures could be taken to ensure that that could happen. But it is the developers, they're aware that there's capacity issues, and so they are talking to the wastewater treatment work provider, and they're looking at alternative provision.
Thank you. Okay, Councillor Rattigan, please.
Thank you, Chair. Just as a thanks to Councillor McCormick, just shows you how much you can talk with only asking one question. So thank you for showing us the way forward. I'm worried about wastewater treatment, if I am honest. Two questions in one. Is there a way we can condition polished water back into the test? Are we allowed to do that, or can the Environment Agency give us permits to allow us to do that? And where the hell do the fines go from areas like Hampshire? Because frankly, with £100 million from Southern Water, we ought to be getting some of it back so as we can improve our rivers.
Thank you, Councillor Rattigan. Anne? Ruth,
So we're going to have a go at answering your question, Councillor Radigan. We think that the polished water discharge issue is an Environment Agency issue that we really aren't expert enough to answer on, but that would be a matter for them. In relation to Southern Water, if you lived in the area of the catchment, they had to refund those of us that pay bills in those areas an amount of money in relation to those fines, and they also, had to make other undertakings in relation to, their activities. So the money was, distributed to those of us that pay into those companies directly back to, those of us that pay those bills, as well as, what they needed to in terms of government. I'm envisaging the Environment Agency also, have allocated some of those funds for things as well. So, but we don't have the insight into it. I only know as a resident what we got from it.
thank you, Ruth. Okay, Councillor Tomlin, please.
Thank you, Chair. The first thing is 3.1. The report assesses the capacities of sewage treatment plants. It's failed to all throughout look at the infrastructure of delivery from settlements to those sites, and I find that a massive omission, because we have problems all over Basingstoke that we find out at the planning stage, which I think is a bit too late, because it delays house building, and strangely that has this effect on the 5-year land supply. But in that presentation that we had, it said Southern Water, they considered they have a supply issue, they admitted it, and South East Water said, or they implied, that they have enough water to cover all of the Berkshire and Hampshire new homes requirement up to the end of our plan. But as a company, they are actually concerned that their abstraction permits are likely to see the situation reverse. And both suppliers are looking at water management plans, as we described. And one of that is this consumer usage. How the devil can someone explain to me how we can regulate people, how they can get people to have 4-minute showers and sing the words to Richie Blackmore's Rainbow songs, and that's exactly 4 minutes long, and how we can stop people going to the toilet more than their neighbours. It just makes sense. So it relies on us conserving water and through building regulations. Then we've even as a council got to look at retrofitting all the grey water and all of this technology into our existing housing stock. So it's a massive cost, a massive challenge, and we have to now consider, are we going to support a promise that they will deliver? And I'll just say one last thing. Yesterday, in the Post, because today we didn't get Post because they're on strike or something, I got a flyer from Southern Water reminding me we had a water hosepipe ban and asked me to conserve water. Well, I am a South East Water customer, so they don't even know their customers. So do I trust them? No, I don't, and I think this borough should actually be very suspicious of any of these promises where we don't know what and we don't know by when. But what we hear is that they've had a look at something, decided against it, going to try something else, maybe flood Basingstoke, whatever. It is just, there's nothing there. That's the problem. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments, Councillor Tomlin. Councillor Cubitt, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. So in terms of the solutions, we don't know what they are. In terms of the assumptions on the part of the water cycle study, they make a central assumption that if our river was good status and we were to build the number of houses that we're proposing in the local plan update, then from good status we would not deviate from that band. So it's hypothetical. And I would like to quote something which is extremely important, which is that a computer model does not mean data, and data does not mean fact. And computer models mean, at best, a hypothesis posing as a mathematical fact. So we are here with a water cycle study that's not fit for purpose, that makes an assumption which is, frankly, Alice in Wonderland, because we don't have good status, And we then did not have the Environment Agency attend the meeting with ACOM, so I don't accept that the scrutiny that members have been able to apply to this water cycle study has been true. We haven't had discussions on the impact of artificial recharging and wastewater recycling, and I want to put it on record, and I wish that this is all in the minutes too, that when you artificially recharge rivers, that means that the Valium, the cocaine, the antibiotics, all of the hideous things, the estrogen from the pill, all of those hideous things are not removed when they're artificially recharged into the river. So we will be loading into beautiful crystal, supposedly, waters of our precious chalk rivers, even more cocaine, Valium, antibiotics and estrogen. Finally, what I would like to say in relation to this section, and it's 3.5, all of the points that I've been making are relevant to this section, is that in the newly updated non-spatial plan policies, members will be horrified to hear that whilst in 3.5 we say we're going to work together and coordinate regular updates, etc., la-di-da-di-da, right? We've heard it all before. In the original local plan that we approved in 2016, there was a commitment on the part of the Environment Agency to provide us with annual monitoring, and there was a statement of common ground that stated that the Environment Agency would give us annual monitoring. Well, they failed in that. They decided unilaterally to change it to 3, and in our non-spatial policies update, it demonstrates that they do not intend to give us annual monitoring because the word annual has been removed. Moreover, and this is in relation to the answers to the questions from Councillor Konecki, Councillor Rattigan and Councillor Tomlin, in the original water quality policy, we had an obligation for there not to be a continued deterioration and for there to be annual monitoring. Now it says, if it's approved, wherever possible, development should include measures that will improve the water environment. And where new water supply or wastewater infrastructure is required or proposed in support of new development, the development will be phased alongside the provision of the infrastructure to ensure the following. So wherever possible. So I leave that with you, members. I have no confidence that the wherever possible will ever be achievable. I have no confidence the water companies will provide the solutions that are nebulous and have not been defined. And I have no confidence that the Environment Agency will do what is required of them nationwide to ensure that our rivers are not further deteriorated. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments, Councillor Cubitt. And finally, on this section, Councillor Konecki, please.
Thank you, Chair. So far in this section, we've spoken about water supply, and I think it's consensus in the room seems to be that members are concerned about how South East Water and how Southern Water are actually going to ensure delivery of water, particularly if there's another drought like we've experienced this year. We've also spoken about the wastewater treatment works, and again, we've been promised that everything's going to be okay as long as there's some investment. But there's no detail as to what this investment will be and how we can hold the water companies to account to make sure it happens. The one thing we haven't discussed, and because it doesn't appear to be in our water cycle study, is something that was raised by an independent study that was done by Stand Up for the North Hampshire Downs, which I think was emailed to all members yesterday afternoon. They employed an independent agency to take a look at our water cycle study and critique it. And one of the points they raised right at the end in section 4.3 is that our water cycle study only considers flood risk in terms of the increased wastewater treatment effluent discharges to water courses and does not make any recommendations in relation to identified areas at risk of flooding from surface water, from groundwater and from foul sewers. All are worrying that the foul sewers in particular, as the representative for Brighton Hill, it's noted that Brighton Hill and Hatch Warren have foul sewers that are coming up to capacity, and therefore any upstream additions to that network could cause serious foul sewer leakage. So yeah, we're talking about people's poo appearing in their gardens and potentially in their homes as well. And given this is such an important point, I just wanted clarification really that this independent study is correct in saying that our water cycle study hasn't considered this, because if it hasn't, that's quite a serious omission. So I think that's the question there.
Thank you, Councillor. Let's go. So, Anne.
I've not seen the document that it's referred to from the Stand Up for North Hampshire Downs. The water cycle study is just looking at it in terms of the additional discharges in response to growth, because the strategic flood risk assessment looks at the bigger picture of flooding, and that was completed a year or so ago now.
Sorry, am I allowed a supplementary, Chair?
You can have it.
Thank you. So those concerns around flood risk in relation to foul sewers, for example, they've been assessed elsewhere and shown that this isn't an issue for us with the proposed growth in the local plan.
I really need to see the document you're referring to, but it sounds like it's a bit more specific, really. There have been, I get confused with their catchment plans or catchment management plans prepared by the local lead flood authority of Hampshire County Council that priorities Brighton Hill, and that looks in more detail about surface water flooding. It might be helpful for me to see the document being referred to, and I can respond on that, but I think it's probably more of a specific issue dealt with by the local flood authority.
I'll happily...
Hold on.
Oh, sorry, Chair.
Thank you very much, Anne. I'd like a written reply to the committee, okay, regarding that, if at all possible. Thank you. If you're very quick, Councillor McIntyre, you've got about 30 seconds and I need to move on.
I wouldn't be offended, Mr Chair. I will be quick. It's a pity that Councillor Koniski got in there, because Councillor Cubitt teed me up quite nicely for my question. I agree with a lot of her points that she made. However, I wanted to ask the officers the so what. We have our water cycle study 3.4 that talks about, section 3.4, that talks about a paper-based exercise and the implementation of the necessary treatment process upgrades. And that's obviously subject to those. We obviously have the nutrient neutrality elephant in the room, possibly coming along in 2030. So the question is, we get down that path and the water companies actually haven't done their work, which I'm fairly confident they won't have. What do we do? What is the impact on us? I know the previous mention in one of the previous document packs was the grampian conditions. The question was asked, and I believe it wasn't felt that that is a valued option. So what do we have in our back pocket if the water companies don't pull their socks up? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor McIntyre. Okay, quick answer, Anne?
I think, as you said, this is an early stage in the process. And at the moment this looks at high growth. The water companies aren't going to make investment decisions based on this, because there's no strategy set out, there's no political support or other support in a local plan, and there's been no consultation on a local plan suggesting that what the approach might be. The water companies have to justify their investment, and it will be through going through various processes and going through various stages that they will narrow down exactly what investment and what infrastructure is needed. So this is the first stage of what could be provided and what might be needed. When we do the draft local plan, they will have more specific comments, I would imagine, the water companies, and we will seek more specific comments on specific sites, specific networks and infrastructure. And then as the plan gets adopted, then they can take that more into account in their infrastructure planning process. So I'm sure you're aware the water companies do have this 5-year investment process. Based on this, I think it's unlikely that they're going to take it into account because there's no certainty. But as it gets further down the process, as there's allocations in the local plan, they'll take it more seriously and engage more with developers than if there's master plans and then subsequently at planning application stage. But you're right, it's not until it gets to the planning application stage and detailed submissions of number of houses, what water consumption might be, what specific network infrastructure is needed, that they will actually be looking at seriously what's required. So you're right, it is the gramping conditions, but they can be negotiations and discussions going on well before that.
Thank you, Anne. I noticed that you've got your hand up, Councillor Cubitt. You've already had your one question for this particular section. That we are out of time, unfortunately. Okay, is there a reason why you have your hand up, Councillor Cubitt?
Yeah, I was actually going to do an officer a favour and clarify with an answer to Councillor McIntyre.
Okay, can you get that into 30 seconds?
Yes, under policy section SS4 and under the water quality of both the local plan and the local plan update, it says policy SS4 will prevent further development which exacerbates deterioration within the relevant catchment, and intervention mechanisms will be required prior to the release of any further allocated sites or granting of planning permission. And it says further that in principle development will be triggered and if future supply can't be demonstrated. So we can stop developments under the policy that we have now, and hopefully that section will remain in the new policy update.
Thank you for your points of clarification, Councillor Cubitt. Okay, I want to move on to section 4 now. Okay, does anybody have any recommendations or comments on this particular section about national government? Councillor McCormack.
It states in 4.1, midway through the paragraph, in the autumn the government will table an amendment to the Levelling Up Regeneration Bill to place a new statutory duty on water and sewage companies across England to upgrade wastewater treatment works to the highest technically achievable limits by 2030 in nutrient neutrality areas. Do we have any indication as to the text of that bill, when that bill is going to be made law, and what impact that will have on this local plan?
Ruth.
No.
Thank you. Councillor Cubitt, please.
Yes, I'd like again for it to be minuted that I think that the position of national government is duplicitous and extreme. They're imposing housing numbers on us, whilst also under the withdrawal treaty they agreed to adherence of the Water Framework Directive, and whilst only 14% of our rivers meet the Water Framework Directive. So the position of national government stinks. I'm ashamed of what the Conservative government has done with regards to its failure to finance the Environment Agency properly, its failure to ensure that the rivers met the Water Framework Directive, and I think they're a bunch of completely useless, incompetent environmentalists. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments, Councillor Cubitt. And finally, Councillor Madigan.
Thank you, Chair. I wonder, with the portfolio holder here, if he could make some representations to the Minister to press for us to have the strongest possible statutory duties on wastewater recycling. I think that would be useful.
Is that a yes or a no?
Happy to do that, Councillor Effingham. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, so let's move on to section 5. We have two public speakers. Okay, so I'd like to call forward Councillor Tracy Woodruff, please. Right, Councillor Woodruff, I'm going to pass you over to my Vice Chair, okay, who will take you through the timings. Thank you.
Good evening. Right, you have 2 minutes. I'll let you know when you have 30 seconds.
I just have COVID, so if I start coughing, I might lose a little bit longer. I'm negative.
I'm sure we can make allowances, and hopefully you're feeling better. Yeah, and I'll let you know when you've got about 30 seconds of your time remaining. And that time starts whenever you're ready.
I'm Councillor Tracy Woodruff, Chairman of Whitchurch Town Council, and I appear before you with a serious and earnest request. Tonight you will hear a presentation by Dave George, our hydrologist and subject matter expert. The Loddon and the Test and its aquifer are in danger. Last week we were presented evidence that the aquifer is leaching contaminants. The Test is in serious decline. Whitchurch Wastewater Treatment Works will experience an 86% increase in contaminants, largely due to the proposed Popham Garden Village to meet your housing targets. The Council has resolved to develop an exceptional circumstances case to reduce the overall borough housing figure. This should include the health and sustainability of our water resources, but there has so far been no report presented to us outlining such a case. The full Council on March 24th also unanimously decided to reject the Standard Housing Assessment Method, SHAM, with its out-of-date and artificial figures in favour of the Chalmer model, which is likely to be available next month using up-to-date 2021 census results. This has been accepted by the Cabinet as recorded in the minutes of the 5th of July. And also the MP, your local MP is back to this. Liz Truss has written in a manifesto that she will scrap arbitrary Whitehall-imposed housing targets. The new Levelling Up Secretary wrote to the Planning Inspectorate on July 28th that the National Planning Policy Framework will be amended to reflect the policies of the new Prime Minister. My serious and earnest request to you is that you recommend withdrawing the spatial strategy that is before you on Monday and protect our water resources and our common environment by using a housing requirement figure derived with the Chalmer model in accordance with paragraph 61 of the NPPF. The current spatial strategy is in conflict with the Council's own resolutions, and premature consultation is a waste of time, money and resources. It will engender a huge level of objection, which will mean that an amended draft spatial strategy will have to be the subject of further consultation, which will only extend the programme. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you, Councillor Waldrop. I'd like to bring forward Councillor Harvey, please.
Thank you, Thank you, Andy. I'll try not to use all 4 minutes. Thank you. I don't think any of us can deny the threat of climate change that we've seen this summer across the globe as well as here at home. We declared a climate change emergency, and we also declared an ecological emergency. We unanimously voted for these motions at full council, but they have got to be more than motions on bits of paper. We also voted to reject 18,000 houses, and we said that we wanted infrastructure first. These are commitments that we have all made. We're told that the government instructs us to build 18,000 houses based on its methodology, that any action to do otherwise would possibly be unlawful. I hear our MP tell us it's all down to the council to choose the housing figure, and she's launched a petition which is welcome. The Secretary of State has just confirmed to the Planning Inspectorate that you will appreciate that at present we are considering changes to the planning system. In addition to the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill, which has partly passed the Commons Committee stage in Parliament, it is also our intention to update and consult on the NPPF, and of course in the autumn we will see the new Prime Minister and Cabinet take office. The truth is that there are two fundamental priorities for this council. We need to see homes built that actual local people can afford to live in, and the existing homes be livable. But we also need to protect our environment for generations to come and the generations today. However, our existing residents are crying out for help with investment in existing doctors, schools, roads and water infrastructure that you are discussing tonight. As we debate the future of housing, we can't forget our existing communities and what they're facing right now. You'll hear tonight from experts who've studied and understand the implications of the scale of house building that the current Cabinet are proposing. I say Cabinet because it's they alone who will make the decision to go out for Regulation 18 consultation on the draft local plan that promotes 18,000 houses. They will say, with what evidence base that they have, that 18,000 houses is possible, and it is our draft recommendation. They will not let this decision anywhere near full council. It will be Councillor Bound and Councillor Ganesh's decision on their own with their other Cabinet colleagues. So just a few councillors will decide for the whole of the borough to go to the next stage of the local plan process. Our officers tell us that we can change everything, that Regulation 18 is the best way to protect us. But we know that some developers and their barristers are waiting to argue for the 18,000 houses. And once we say 18,000 houses, putting that genie back in the bottle will almost be impossible, as we've all been arguing. So the current council administration's messed up big time. You've lost the 5-year housing land supply because of games played over Merrydown in the last local plan, and now that unlawful act's coming back to haunt us. And still, not one house has been built on Merrydown. You're desperate for a local plan to try and plug the hole, which won't arrive at best until late 2024, but you're driving ahead with 18,000 houses regardless, and in the meanwhile you debate and consult on Reg 18 while developers will use the intervening period to bring forward sites because we don't have a 5-year housing land supply, and they'll try and force them through. And because you're touting 18,000 houses, you will need to see these sites. It's basically got big neon signs over the top of them saying the development of principle is supported. Developers like Genco at Whitchurch, who care only for themselves, and are now, as I speak, seeking to hold secret pre-application meetings with this council, willing to pay for this council's advice to bring forward planning applications to promote over 1,000 houses in the AONB. If we don't wrestle with this now and find a collective spine, we risk damaging our borough beyond anything this council has ever allowed. And your questions this evening expose that. You've all exposed that collectively this evening with what you have been discussing. So I say the government has got to be challenged, but sensibly and with thought, and the needs and concerns of local people in our borough need to be clearly expressed in our local plan. And I say a letter from the Secretary of State to PINS, effectively telling councils, the inspectors, to help councils find a way through and make their plans sound is a chink of armour we should exploit. I will do whatever is needed with colleagues to defend our borough from excessive expansion, and we say no to irrevocably damaging our environment. We say that we want a truly affordable local homes, we want infrastructure first, but above all, even tonight, you need to take the climate change crisis seriously, and water is a fundamental part of that debate.
Thank you very much, Councillor Harvey. Okay, what we're now on to section number 5. Okay, before we get to Mr. George's presentation, does anybody have any comments, recommendations on this very short paragraph? No? Okay. So what I'd like to do is to move and introduce Mr. David George. Okay, and your presentation, please. Thank you.
Sorry, did you hear that? You did, yes, absolutely. Right, if I can work this. Firstly, I'd like to introduce Lawrence Holden at the back there. He's been working with us, and he's a consultant hydrogeologist, just as I am. He's been doing some work for us, funded by the Hampshire and Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust, and we have to give acknowledgement to that. So thank you, Lawrence, for all you've done in terms of help. I'd like to I've been limited time, so I'm going to paraphrase that. You've all got copies of the slides, so I'm going to quickly rattle through these, if I may, and try and paraphrase it. Looking at the work on the water cycle study in Loddon, it basically says, as far as I can see, that the Loddon is running out of environmental capacity in lots of ways if it's going to remain in moderate status. We're in a position now, is even if they uprate the sewage treatment works at Basingstoke to best available technology, we're going to be struggling with the current proposals for housing in that area fundamentally. And I think it just shows that basically the Loddon, even though it's been a high quality chalk river warranting special protection, as basically now is proposed that it goes into derogation, which I think just shows where we're going with the housing. It's just everything's going downhill, and the water framework is just documenting what's happening in reality rather than being shown as any real targets or what have you. It really is quite appalling. And so the trouble with that now is, have we run out of capacity in the Loddon now, in lots of ways? Are we now going to do the same to the test? And that's the big question, because that's where we seem to be going now. 5,500 homes, well, that compares to about whole of Whitchurch is about 2,600 homes of that order. So in that catchment, we're going to be putting a large number of houses, including Popham, as we've discussed. And it's going to produce, I know there's some discussion about alternatives, but even if Popham has its own water treatment works, it's still going to end up going into the aquifer in the Test Valley anyway. So we're ending up with a lot more sewage effluent going into the sewage treatment works and then into the chalk aquifer, and that's the big issue. We've mentioned, I'll call it LURB because it's a big levelling up and regeneration bill, but basically it sounds great, and you know, there's a lot of good stuff there, but it's all basically links through to Natural England's advice. And basically, if you look at that, the test and the itching only are included within that, so it doesn't affect the Loddon whatsoever. And the biggest problem we've got is, for some unknown reason, phosphate has been excluded from the nutrients. So it's only nitrate this is going to affect in the test. And phosphate is the one thing which will kill the test, not nitrates. Nitrates only affect the solent and what have you, and we can understand they want protecting, but there is no protection in LERB for the test really at all. Other, you know, nitrates aren't really a worry. It's the phosphates that are going to kill them. And as you can see, if I go in, there's the catchment. So basically, the southern part, we've got five sewage treatment works, 4 of which are really mentioned in the water cycle study. The 2 are upstream of the river, and they've got very long flow paths, so they just affect the aquifer. That's all really the ones at the top north. But Overton and Whitchurch are the 2 principal sewage treatment works, but they discharge not into the river like the Loddon, they discharge into the chalk. In fact, all 4 discharge into the chalk. Now, I remember sitting here at the back there and being told that basically sewage works didn't really contribute much to nutrient problems in the Test Valley. Well, I could give you all the technical details, but why the devil then are they really now considering all this LERB? Why are they considering Natural England doing all this work on nitrate neutrality and extending it to phosphates? If that was true, that they didn't have any impact, why are they doing that? That's the simple answer. I'll leave you to answer that question. The ecological test at the moment, condition, it's really, as you know, it's a very, very pleasant river. It's a very beautiful river. It features on telly as one of the top in the country. It's one of 12 chalk streams protected as SSI. That's only 15% of the total. The Itchen has additionally a SAC, what you call a SAC. It's a special area of conservation, and it has sort of salmon in it and things like that. It's only one of 6 streams, in fact, that support salmon. So the fishing in there is world renowned. And really, it's still in a position where it's one of the most species-rich rivers in the country, so it's wonderful in that respect. But we're starting to see things creeping on the edge now. We're starting to see signs of illness creeping in, showing decay. And also, I'm talking about quality here, but also it's very, very important, particularly in the headwaters. If we're going to have salmon coming up from the sea, there has to be flow in the river. And that's a big problem as well we've got. And the flow, the mouth of the test also supplies the Itchen as well. So if the water doesn't come down the test, the salmon can't get up the Itchen, basically. Here's just an example of some of the problems we're starting to see now. It's called Filamentous Algae. It starts to smother some of our gravel beds and other things are happening. And what I've done throughout this presentation, you'll see a little box there with some orange text in it. There's areas, basically, quotes from the water cycle study. We agree with many of the quotes that are in there. It's just some of the approaches we're not too happy about. But you can see that only 18% of the habitats in the test now are considered favourable. I am now going to go into a little bit of science because I think I want you to understand this. I know it's probably a bit boring and what have you, but I'd like to go into because it underpins what I'm going to tell you. If we have a look, and I've mentioned here that we've got our wastewater treatment works and they all go into the chalk aquifer. We've got one very positive thing about that is that it all has what they call an unsaturated zone, which is a bit above the water table. And that actually helps a bit, believe it or not. It actually takes out some of the nitrate in the process, which is very, very helpful. It denitrifies it, basically, and it ends up as nitrogen. And so that unsaturated zone is very important. And most of the water treatment works have it's 10 metres or more, so there are some positive things about it going into the chalk. However, there's also some negatives which I'll go into. If we look at the plume, well, you know, I won't go into that detail. You can see fundamentally some of these flow paths, the water cycle study suggests that for Whitchurch it's 1.8 kilometres the flow path, but we've got some evidence to show it's considerably shorter than that now. Overton is a couple of 100 metres or so, but the other ones, which are up above the headwaters, have got many kilometres, and fundamentally anything we put in those ends up and stays in the aquifer. It doesn't go anywhere fundamentally. In terms of the way that the chalk has been used over the years, it has been received all this sewage treatment works. Originally, it didn't even have any treatment in place. You know, they didn't have any, if you look back in the records, but now they put simple filter beds, but the technology in most of the sort of sewage treatment works is really rudimentary compared to some. What happens is, once this has gone through the unsaturated zone and down into the chalk, I'm taking two particular nutrients here, that's nitrates and phosphates. They act differently. The nitrates, what they do is they soak into the chalk blocks, because basically the aquifer is like a series of sponges with gaps in between. And it soaks in, nitrate just soaks into these chalk blocks and is held in there, which is nice. The phosphate actually adheres to the outside, so there's two totally different mechanisms in play here. And this is important in that as you, if I just go back a slide, as you go down the plume, because the contamination soaks in and is absorbed on the chalk, basically the water continues flow, but the contamination front just moves much more slowly. And eventually it'll go through and it'll reach what I call a breakthrough condition. It exceeds the capacity of the aquifer to absorb these things. And so it then breaks through into the river or to the springs or what have you. So I'm just summarising here. You can see that the other point there is the volume of water in the chalk blocks is very great indeed. It's about 30 times that in the mobile water. So there's a lot of capacity there for it to absorb nitrate. And really we're getting to a position now where some of these, even though they're 100 metres or kilometres away from the river, the capacity of those aquifers to absorb all that contamination is being exceeded. Fundamentally, that's the problem we have. Right. Quickly go into now why this standstill method that was used in the water cycle study. The trouble with that is it's great. Firstly, it assumes that what we're doing now is totally acceptable, but as I've explained to you, the aquifer is soaking this up, and it's like having a big bucket. You continually pour any contamination in, and at some point it's going to overflow, and then when it overflows, you've got a problem. But while you're filling that bucket up, you're thinking, oh, this is nice. We haven't got any problems here whatsoever. So we have this issue. But if I go through them, there's a number of assumptions that aren't correct, actually. Firstly, the second point down is the capacity of the aquifer to protect the river will not be exceeded. Well, it's getting to that point now. The additional flow capacity will not be used before the wastewater treatment plants will be upgraded. That's another issue. If you look at the current consents, the standstill method is assumed on current flows, but there's still some capacity for Whitchurch is about 25%. Now, clearly, if we put 25% more through, we've got more contamination going in, so it's not standstill. It really isn't. Also, I'll go to it, there's an increased hydraulic flow will have no impact on contamination, but that's not correct either. And this really comes down to mobilisation of the contamination that's already stored in there. I'll go into that in a minute. And the other thing is they do this wonderful thing where they include BODs within the consent limits. But one of the worst things you can possibly do under these circumstances is possibly reduce the BOD loading, because that's the thing that helps to take the nutrient out in the first place. So it's not properly thought through, frankly. If I go for nitrates and what have you, because just to explain the situation, you've got all these blocks full of nitrates. You've been pushing contaminated water through for decades, and it's reached equilibrium with this chalk. You've got the same concentration in the chalk blocks as you have in the water flowing through it. If suddenly you decide to put a lower concentration, but more water through, all that will happen is that more water going through will actually come in equilibrium with the chalk. Therefore, the flux reaching the river, will be much higher. And this is the problem we have. So even if we treat water down to I've got three little curves there, the water cycle study standstill. We are going to get a big slug of nitrates going to the river for a period of time. You've got three ones there. There's no improved treatment at all, but you can see in yellow, the water cycle study standstill, so we've got this big slug going to the river. Admittedly, if we get to 10 milligrams per litre on the LERB, that will help tremendously in reducing it, but that's not legislation yet, and we don't know whether it's going ahead, but that's the position, actually. And looking at the impact, the quick question is, so what? You know, because this has been soaking in for decades, there's a lot of nitrate in there. And if we look at it, we've done some calculations, but this is equivalent to, you know, the flux from about 1,500 homes going to be ending up in that river, which would be offset, should we say, by nitrate. Or even if we look at other calculations over a long period of time, we're still talking about 750 ohms for about 14 years. So there's a big chunk of nitrate going to end up going down the river if we do, as they suggest in the water cycle study, and put more hydraulic capacity through at a lower rate. It's very simple. It's all basic hydraulics, really, and science. So that's it. Mentioned, I think, we talked about dual porosity modelling and everything else, but basically it's quite simple to run these sorts of calculations using a dual porosity model, and it's probably something that ought to be done at some stage, actually, to have a look at it. And the key problem we've got here, this isn't about, you know, simple technology. This is, you've got to resolve this. You know, one of the things we can do is put for example, the water treatment works in an entirely different place in a new treatment works, but without doing something like that, it's much more difficult to actually resolve this problem. It really is. Phosphates, well, they're the killer, basically. It's the same with the Loddon, and it's the same with the test. Phosphates are really, really nasty things. And you can see there, the test, this is a quote directly from the water cycle study, the test is very species rich, which is considered to be particularly sensitive to phosphate pollution. And that's absolutely correct, it really is. And it's suggesting there that there is potential for sewage effluent to reach the SSSI via the groundwater base flow. So we agree with that entirely. Now, the issue again is very much the same, phosphates as in nitrates. Either you have breakthrough, or you can get remobilization, or you can get both. And the big problem we've got with phosphates is the levels required to cause a problem are much, much lower than nitrates. They're way down in the micrograms per litre rather than the milligrams per litre. At about 150th of the nitrate concentration, with phosphates starting causing problems. So this is the big issue we've got. You can see there that really it was mentioned that agriculture was causing all these problems. Well, no, hang on. The reality is that the phosphate from agriculture gets absorbed in the root zones and the soils and everything else, and very little of it ends up in the river from agriculture. Whereas the flow paths from the sewage treatment works are much shorter. They'll get then completely saturated in these things, and they will cause problems. So, no, I'm sorry, phosphate from sewage treatment works is a real problem in this area, it really is. And so what's again, again, read the orange. Can you see that on the screens at all? That's again the water cycle study. Can you read it all or not? No? It's not very good.
It's not easy.
Okay. But they do admit that admit all that I've said there, it has limited capacity, and that once that capacity is exceeded, it will dissolve and get in the stream. So it says that. And really looking at the numbers, I've done some calculations, but basically somewhere between 100 and 200 tons of phosphate have gone through the water treatment works over the years. A lot of it has ended up being held up in the chalk. And that compares to about 2.5 tons per year going down the river. So it's a big number that's held up there in chalk. And I will then go on to show you what's happening now. We've looked at the locations where this is now coming out. The water cycle study assumes that the water goes down the hydraulic gradient, but I think we've found out where it actually does go, and it follows probably a lineation of a dry valley route. And you can see here it's only 500 rather than 1.8 kilometres away. So it's a much shorter area or length for it to absorb. And if we look, there's the spring where this is coming out. Now that is really nasty eutrophication. That's awful stuff. You don't want that in your river. But that is now going into the test. That is going to the test. We've done some tests on it, and basically it's high in phosphates. We want to get some proper water samples, but that is literally at the end of that 500 metres thing, and that's what's actually ending up going in the river now. So we are showing signs now that phosphates are breaking through. The breakthrough has occurred there, and the last thing we want is for that to occur. The other thing is that if we put a new treatment process in place on the wastewater treatment works, that inevitably the process will involve changes in process, changes in volumes, changes in BODs, and it's found that phosphates are particularly sensitive to those changes. So if those changes occur, it is very, very likely it will happen that the phosphate will be mobilised. And if, again, like the nitrates, we could end up with a big slug of phosphates ending up in our rivers, and that's a real concern to us. And that needs to be looked into, and it's something that really has just been, well, not even considered, I don't think, in the water cycle study in any way. Okay. And I'll go to this because this is important. You know, all this is highly technical stuff, but the precautionary principle really applies here. It's enshrined in UK law, particularly for environmental issues, and really it puts the onus on people who are passing plans and things like that to show that there is going to be no impact rather than the other way round. It's as simple as that. It really is. And at the moment we've got nothing to show there's going to be no impact. We've got no scientific evidence. We've got a lot of evidence to show that it is occurring, which is helpful, but there's nothing there to show that it will not happen. And before we start putting or agreeing to lots and lots of houses, we need to be clear that this is correct. I just put that quote in the bottom because that worries me extensively. The groundwater body is extensive and establishing if the soils have reached the saturation level of stored phosphorus would require extensive surveys and interpretation. Okay, well, you know, it'll take a little effort, but then he goes on to say, linking the impact directly solely to the increased wastewater treatment workflows would likely be inconclusive, though given the extent of the water body and therefore other influencing factors. I'm not quite sure what he's about there, but it does seem to be saying, well, if this does occur, we can't really blame the water companies, and that really worries me. That's not in the spirit of the precautionary principle at all, and I'm really concerned about that as something that shouldn't be in that document. So we've gone through that. I've talked a little bit about this, and I don't think I'm willing to go into in detail, but I have pointed out here that basically the phosphates could be mobilised, and if that happens, it's going to be a really significant impact. And that at the moment, since we haven't got a phosphate limit for Whitchurch in particular, there is one for Overton, we haven't got one for Whitchurch, no assessment was made in the water cycle study at all. They didn't propose any limit, and they're saying, well, this is something that Southern Water ought to look at in detail themselves. But we've talked about it tonight. Would we want Southern Water actually marking their homework here? It's going to require a big investment. It'd be a huge impact if something goes wrong here. Do we really want them doing it? And they also say that it should be investigated before significant new growth is permitted in the catchment. Well, this is the time it should be done. We should be understanding this now, not, you know, it's no good proposing that we're going to put 5,000 homes there, including in our spatial strategy, and then at some point saying, oh, well, we can't build them there. That's going to be nonsense, isn't it, really? So it really needs to be done at this stage. I'll go into this one. The other big area which is excluded from the water cycle study is around priority substances. I think Councillor Cubitt mentioned these, but these are all the nasty things that do funny things to fish and biota. It is an issue in that, unfortunately, like the phosphate and nitrate, these get stored in the chalk. And so the longer, if it's just goes out into the river, you can see the effects, but this is going to be stored in the chalk, it's going to be concentrated up in the chalk, and at some point it's going to hit us. Now, like all of these things, the biggest problem we've got, it doesn't cost much to pollute things, but it costs a lot of money to clean them up, and that's a big issue. And the other big problem with the chalk is once the effects of all this are seen, it's too late to do anything about it. It's infeasible, it's too costly, and it's not technically achievable. So we have a real issue here in terms of, by the time the effect's seen, particularly as you've got now a 3-year monitoring cycle and then a 5-year AMP cycle, well, when are things going to get done? It's a real problem, isn't it? I won't go into them in more detail. I know that the government are looking at trying to control these things at source, but the reality is they're going out in the sewage effluent at the moment and they're being accumulated, and we're just going to see more of those being accumulated in chalk if we put more sewage effluent through. It's as simple as that. I'll go through quickly then on availability of water. Well, I think the water cycle study says it all, doesn't it? And you've all talked about it tonight. We've got problems. Simple as that. It's not an issue. A lot of it, I've noticed in the water cycle study, is theoretical, and that worries me. Once people say things are theoretical, it means, yeah, you can do it in theory, but there's absolutely no chance of them being occurring in practice. You know, there's a lot of talk about it. I won't go into the detail. But until, you know, we've got that, there's this temporary use ban going on. And you can see there's the Southern Water position, which includes, or confirms that really they can't supply sufficient water in a drought situation. Number one, they haven't got enough in the Southern Water Zone. And that basically until then, we're going to get these hose pipe bans and droughters orders in place. And it's going to be problematic. You know, for the test, they're already taking out, well, we'll go into that, I think, actually. And although there's a lot of talk about Southern Water securing alternative supplies, the reality is there's nothing really hard and fast. I agree. You know, I was talking to somebody again about desalination. Well, it's great, but are we going to actually pay for desalination? What are these current power prices? That's one of the power hungriest processes we've got. You know, it's just going to be totally and utterly ridiculous when gas is, you know, they've got to have a power source to run desalination plants. It's going to be extraordinarily expensive. So we have a real issue there. So there's no really visible route out of all of this at the moment, as I can see. And we've got the reality in 2020, and I think that says it all. We've got the derogations in place. Sorry, we've got the hose pipe bans in place. We've got hands-off flows now, which is going to affect all the flows in the river, and that is now affecting the fish stocks. There's absolutely no doubt about that at all, because this is the time of year the salmon start coming, and we've got a problem now. I also put one slide up there, which is clearly, it's probably modest compared to the rest of Basingstoke-on-Deane, but there's a very, very significant local economy around the test in terms of fishing, in terms of tourism, the silk mill. We've got the gin distillery down there, Bombay Sapphire, and what have you. And a lot of it, you know, tourists will stand on Whitchurch Bridge looking at the trout. That's all they do. They look at the trout and they throw bread in to see which is going to get it first, the ducks or the trout. It's on our town symbol. This is all part of our heritage. And unless we get this right, we're going to lose it all, frankly. And the reality is, unless we get it right at this stage now, before we start saying, well, yes, we'll put some development in place and we might think about the quality issues afterwards, all this is going to go. There's no doubt about it at all. And, of course, at the moment, all this is in the hands of the water companies. I'll just flash that one, but Southern Water comes out at 1-star rating, according to the Environment Agency, in terms of environmental protection. Thames is a bit better, it's at 2-star, but we're, you know, are we really going to put the hands of our beautiful Barbuck Borough and all these places in the hands of a water company with that level of credibility, frankly? And if we look at the quality of our water bodies, we've already talked about the derogation for the Loddon. I don't know quite where that leaves us. Perhaps the officers can answer that one, really. You know, can we... Are we limited to keeping it at moderate, or can we take it into poor, or can we just keep on polluting it? I don't know, and that's an interesting point. I don't know the answer to that. And Basically, our aquifer is going to continue getting polluted with these proposals in place. There's no doubt about it. They're basically saying goodbye 2027 was their original target. It's now goodbye 2060. Well, what are they doing? There's no real proposals to clean it up. It's just kicking the can down the road, isn't it, basically? And the EA recognise that 97% of the flow from the aquifer ends up in the river anyway. So if we pollute the aquifer, well, you know, the test is going to go, isn't it, frankly? And the other thing is really over it is the failure to include phosphate in the Natural England guidance shows lack of any commitment to the river whatsoever. And that's a document produced by the Environment Agency and Natural England. And that really worries me. You know, it's only one of three rivers not to have phosphate in. And why haven't they included it? I have no idea whatsoever. It's a triple SI. It's one of 15% of triple SIs. Why have they not included phosphate? They weren't there. Unfortunately, they didn't come to the meeting on the 23rd. When they were invited, evidently they couldn't manage it for some reason or other, lab availability of staff, whatever. But we wanted to ask those questions, very important questions, but they weren't available. And as I mentioned, the point at the bottom is once problems occur, it's too late because the water's in the aquifer already. There's lots of it. It's not going to be possible to clean up the aquifer to protect the river. It's just not technically feasible, so we can say goodbye to it, frankly. And then the last one is deliverability, I think. Well, we looked at the programmes contained in the water cycle study. There's a lot there, and I noticed the other report from Stan that came through. It has exactly the same conclusion here. This is all, you know, there's no chance of this being actually delivered in principle, in reality. It's great, it looks great, but they're not going to deliver all of this. And basically, we're going to end up paying the price, frankly. And this is, in fact, a comment from the inspector from the existing plan, and it still states today. You know, we need some clarity is necessary to demonstrate that the local plan is deliverable at an environmentally acceptable standard. We haven't got that in the water cycle study at all. It doesn't occur. And these sorts of comments from the water cycle study worry me. Nitrate improvements identified by the water cycle study, a future business case by Southern Water to Ofwat would be needed to secure this as a long-term investment. So in other words, where it comes to nitrate improvements, for example, well, that's some way long down the road once we've built lots of houses, and it's a perhaps might occur aspiration, fundamentally, that comes across, and it does worry me. The other thing I'd like to mention here, in terms of Chapter 8, the recommendations in the water cycle study, it puts emphasis here on, this Grampian clause is mentioned, which is great, but if you look at it carefully, it's only for non-availability of capacity flow. That's where the Grampian clauses are going to go. If there isn't the infrastructure in place to treat the water, well, that's evidently not quite so important. That's not worthy of a Grampian clause. And I really think they've got that the wrong way round. You know, I think basically we ought to be protecting our environment rather than fundamentally sitting down and saying, well, we're going to facilitate lots of houses and we're going to allow Southern Water to treat the water, but not to a standard which will protect our environment. And that's where, at the moment, I would ask perhaps the committee here and the officers to consider how we can improve that in the local plan, because at the moment it's all about providing capacity and very little about protecting the environment. It really is. Yeah, I think I've covered that. Before I go on to the workload forward, I'd like to really just put some concluding remarks. Am I all right here, Stuart? Sorry, Councillor Frost. I think I've got some sort of summary here, which is phosphates, which wastewater treatment works contribute significantly to, are the limiting nutrient to our rivers. It's true of the Loddon and the Test and the Itchen as well. Loddon's already reaching its environmental capacity unless new technology to remove phosphates is implemented. That's clear. The Test chalk aquifer has protected the rivers against wastewater treatment works for many decades. It has. It's soaked it all up nicely for us. The assessments in the wastewater treatment, in the water cycle study ignore the aquifer and assume falsely that it will continue to soak up the contamination into the future. It won't do that. The test is on the edge. It's already showing signs of capacity being reached for these soaking up and breakthrough occurring in some areas. The proposed changes result in mobilisation of contaminants as well, both in terms of chemistry and in terms of flow. It's not clear there will be an easy technical fix to these problems if we start doing that. You know, I think the water cycle study goes a long way to suggesting whether all this can be fixed technically. No, you've got to look at this in detail, and there's not easy fixes to this. And that there appears to be no commitment to protecting the test, I'm afraid. That comes from LERB and the natural England stuff. And also, we haven't got a policy for the test. We've got one for the Loddon, but why haven't we got one for the test? It seems very odd. The emphasis on the recommendation seems to be towards providing flow capacity rather than protecting the environment. It's all about that, and that's where pride lies. Particularly comments, I'm very worried about the comments about using the headroom. There's basically, the water cycle study states that for the older treatment works, if you use that additional headroom, they're not designed, basically, there's no guarantee that the Water Framework Directive targets will be met. Yet, we're getting, well, if there's headroom available, we'll use that. Well, that's going to impact on the environment. You know, it's very clear. Certainly, if we look at, for example, for the test, we've currently got a limit of phosphate to go from high to good of 42. In the test at the moment, it's 39, so we need that much extra. 25% additional capacity will blow us through that completely. Absolutely as easy as pie. So, and that really comes down to, what was it, policy SS4? Are we going to use that to stop development? I hope so, because that's what it says in our local plan, we can do that. But that's going to take, basically, any increased capacity at the moment is going to blow that limit, and we're going to end up with losing a complete, you know, downgrading for that particular element, which I understand is against policy SS4. But are we going to use it? I don't know. Question. If we also look at the, we've talked about the LERB, I won't go into that. The Southern Water plans involved, if you look at their plans for investment, it's clear what they're going to do is they've included investment. These are the plans that are going through consultation at the moment, lots of them in detail. There's lots of money in there, 1.25 million for increased capacity, but nothing about increased treatment again, which just underlines this problem. We want to put more through there, but we don't want to increase treatment capacity. It does say there's some money in there for studying the nutrient balance, but, well, I'm afraid that's not much help, really. I was a consultant all my life, and frankly, if I didn't want to do something or a client didn't want to do it, it'd study it, basically, I'm afraid. That's an way of doing things. So there's no real commitment there, and the upgrades to improve capacity are improved treatment are described as long-term investments only. The water supply situation is critical, with drought orders being imposed until alternative supplies are brought online, and we don't know quite what they're going to be or where they're going to go. Others agree that there are grounds for doubt that the water company programmes to deliver the infrastructure required to protect the environment was delivered on time or support the spatial strategy. We can't guarantee that, and I think we've had another study, independent study, that totally agrees entirely with that. We really, I would like to see us being stronger on the water companies. We really need to put quality of our environment before delivering the houses. I'm sorry about that, but we need in our policy to actually be stronger on them, and our policies need to be stronger on them to deliver quality. At the moment, I don't see that. I really don't. And the final comment is, unless we do that now, will the tests go the same way as a Loddon, and we'll lose this valuable resource. Thank you. I did put together a way forward because we want to be constructive here. There are some suggestions there, and I thought we were going to have a bit of debate on these, but You know, some of these again have been really.
Can you go through those for us?
Can you not read them? I think you can't read them. I'm sorry. I've done a bit sort of death by PowerPoint here, haven't I? Put too much on these slides. The first one says reduction in the total number of homes to be delivered on the basis of inadequate environmental capacity, or again we're talking about that, and not only that, the calculation methods I think was one of those. Rethinking the spatial strategy to place less demand and impact on those areas most vulnerable to water supply and wastewater impacts. And I noticed the other independent study goes on to say, well, we also need to think about where the current water infrastructure is, so we can build on that, which I think is very, very sensible as well. We think we really need competent scientific assessments of the impacts of the proposed changes to wastewater treatment works, as I've suggested, particularly phosphates, before committing to development as recommended. I think we really need to do that. To consider the environmental impact of utilising existing flow capacity at older water treatment works, as the water cycle study clearly states that could be a problem. And I really, if I was doing this, looking at the possibilities of non-delivery, I'd be doing a risk assessment of non-delivery. This is so important that, you know, before you put any plan in place that's critical like this, you do a risk assessment. You say, well, you know, if we couldn't do this and if we can't do that, what would our fallback positions be? It's very sensible, but I don't see anything along those lines at all in terms of a risk assessment. And I think there's some real risks of non-delivery of this. And so what do we do, frankly? I think we, and I talked to Simon Bound about this, but we need high-level meetings with the EA to fully understand their position, because particularly over the natural income guidance and things like that, we need to fully understand that. If they're written off the test, we need to know about it. We really do. You know, if that's their position, because at the moment, that's the way it seems, actually. The inclusion in the local plan of a policy to protect the test, parallel to the London one, which is very important. The implementation of strategic granting clauses to situations where water companies have not agreed or revised discharge standards with the Environment Agency, so we can ensure that the quality is there before we build the housing. And I think we need to lobby of government, Natural England, to extend enhanced phosphate treatment to the test wastewater treatment marks under the proposal legislation. And I think that's very important also, given basically our potentially new Prime Minister's recent comments on being harder on the wastewater treatment companies and protecting our chalk streams. If she wants to protect one, well, we're one of the top 15% in the country here, so she's got to actually live up to that. So those are my suggestions in terms of possible ways forward.
Thank you very much. Mr. George, that was most welcome, and I think the committee will thank you. The committee were very grateful for your input. I now want to go through a quick, questions. Okay. No, one per member. Okay, and then if I've got time going forward, okay, then we'll continue. So, Councillor Tomwin, please.
Sorry. Thank you, Chair. David, thank you. That was incredibly informative, and I think the borough owes you a great debt. That information, yes, exactly. It's a pivotal moment, I think. We can totally ignore what you've said, or we embrace it and we do something about it. And I don't know what I can do other than support that we do something about it. But I wouldn't say I'm now a hydrologist at all, but my goodness me, do I understand a lot more than I did before I came into this building. So I think we must implore the portfolio holder through to the leader to talk to government. We've got to have those conversations. And one little question is, was everything that you presented available to AECOM, or is it outside of their, maybe it's a question you can't answer, was it outside of their comfort zone or their experience zone, why we haven't had such depth? Or I think you once said that the water cycle study was a a different sort of exercise? That was the question there. Thank you.
Sorry, thank you. It's a very good question. I think the water cycle study did what it did, and the level of detail, I must admit, for the test. For the Loddon, it was quite a good modelling exercise. You know, they went through things, and things aren't perfect in any way, but you know, at least they did try and quantify the impacts and what have you. I think for the test, given the delay in, should we say, being able to see the water cycle study, well, it was frankly quite basic. Now, they would argue that's the stance that they agree with the Environment Agency, and it's the one that is sometimes used. But I think in general, you know, and probably what I've gone into is in detail, and I'm a hydrogeologist, and I understand these things, you know. But in general, if you look at much of the work that the Environment Agency and Natural England do, the geology and the hydrogeology is ignored. It is ignored. And this is a big problem. You know, it even comes through the Natural England guidance on all of this, the housing offset. You know, if they took the geology and hydrogeology into account, and particularly the ability to denitrify in the unsaturated zone, we wouldn't have the level of offsets that we've got. But in general, I'm afraid that the geology and what have you is just ignored, I'm afraid, and that's the reality of the situation. So AECOM will probably argue, well, we weren't required to go into that level of detail at this stage, but I think possibly, hopefully, I've demonstrated tonight, it is a fundamental issue, and it is something that should be taken into account in these sorts of things, under the circumstances where water is discharged to the groundwater or to the aquifers. Where it discharges to the rivers, standstill calculation is perfectly valid because it's a one-dimensional thing. But when you've got this stored contamination in place and all this interaction, it just doesn't work, I'm afraid. It's as simple as that.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. George. Okay, Councillor McCormack, please.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, and thank you, David, for a most informative presentation. I'm still trying to get my head around the concept of an aquifer that's like a giant sponge absorbing all these various chemical substances. Basically, I'd like to ask a question about phosphates and green algae. Now, my understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that phosphate pollution, the majority of that is agricultural-based pollution, although some of that might be human settlement pollution as well. How do we mitigate against that? I'm thinking we should have some kind of reference to that in the local plan, because it looks like the test is potentially teetering on the brink as a result of a threat from phosphates that doesn't seem to be in any of our planning policies at the moment. And similarly with green algae, I mean, how do we mitigate against that? Is there any, looking at what we've declared an ecological emergency, is there anything we can do in terms of the ecosystem to introduce new species that could consume green algae, for instance, or is there something that we can do to stop it growing in the first place? I'd be very interested to hear if you have any answers to that, or maybe where we can go look for answers. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that question. If I take the last one first, because that's an easy one, I'm sorry, I'm not an expert in the field, but I know we have people fundamentally who are Test and Itching Association, people like that. So there's some very strong groups, Chalk Stream Alliance and things like that, who would maybe be able to answer those questions, and they've got good expertise in those areas. But I personally wouldn't deem to answer that question. Unfortunately, it's not my area. In terms of the importance of phosphates, you are correct. I did some calculations to have a look at that. You know, the normal bag of fertilizer is mainly basically nitrate fertilizer, but it does have about, I did some look on the web and came up, it's about 13% phosphate as peak. So if you look at what the farmers put on their fields, there's quite a lot of phosphate there. But the telling thing is if you actually have a look at the level actually that reaches the rivers, it's very low indeed. If you look, at the nitrate, well, that's, so we say 85%, it gives rise to about 8 milligrams per litre in the river. The stuff that comes down gets through all the agricultural process and impacts the river is only about 40 micrograms, 150th of that. So although we apply a lot of phosphate, most of it gets taken up in the crops and the soil zone and everything else. So only a relatively small proportion of it ends up polluting the river. Now compare that then to, unfortunately, where you've got the sewage treatment works that either directly discharges it or it goes through the aquifer, but the aquifer becomes saturated, you end up with 100% getting through there. So when you do the calculations on fluxes, the amount coming through in sewage effluent is about the same as that coming down from agriculture. It's not the same for nitrates, it's about 10%, but for phosphate, it's a much higher proportion comes from sewage effluent than from agriculture, so a greater higher proportion.
Thank you very much.
Sorry.
We have Councillor Watts, please.
Thank you, David. That was very informative. Who else have you shared your report with? You've shared it with Environment Agency and Natural England, and are you aware of whatever councils are doing on their local plan that face on to the test? Are they taking a more vigorous line than us? Do you know, are you aware?
Taking from the top, who have we shared this with? We've shared this at the moment with, on the 23rd, we shared this with basically Basingstoke and Dean Planning Department, so they were forewarned of what was coming up today, and we were able to discuss it to some degree. We haven't shared it with anybody else to date, really, in any great detail. The idea is that Lawrence, who sits back there, is going to write a formal paper on this, and this is being funded under this programme. As I mentioned, it was funded by the Hampshire and Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust because they're worried about the river as a habitat, and they wanted to know about the role of the aquifer in the whole process. So there will be a formal report produced. It will go to Hampshire and Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust, and they will have a copy of that fundamentally. I haven't shared it with anybody else other than that, and I'm sorry I'm not aware of other councils taking similar stances in any way. I'm afraid I haven't done that. It probably comes down to, again, I'm looking at Lawrence now, there's hydrogeologists are fairly few and far between, I'm afraid. We're a rare species. And we're spread fairly thinly, I'm afraid. So it's not something that will come or arise on many occasions. You know, a lot of the councils don't have the expertise in this area to be able to consider this. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Councillor Konesko, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Dave, for that presentation. Really illuminating and really depressing as well, if I'm honest. So the water cycle study, if you take it at face value, the one we've commissioned says that everything's going to be okay if the water companies make the necessary investments, and they're legally obliged to make those investments. But I think, having heard your presentation today, I think it's not quite so clear cut. And this is what worries me, and it sort of worries me in relation to the future planning process. Because we were told earlier that what's going to happen is that there'll be specific planning applications for the specific sites at some point further down the line, and they'll need to demonstrate that they're not going to cause any adverse environmental impact, including any adverse impact on the hydrogeology. Now, there is potentially a risk, or a high probability, I would argue, that the developers could commission their own environmental impact assessments. When it comes to the hydrogeology, they could use similar assumptions, similar methodologies to the water cycle study. And that will show that everything is okay, provided the water companies invest, and the water companies will back them up because they're legally obliged to say that they invest. And that means that we, as a local authority, have very little scope to reject these applications, even though we know the reality, if you look beneath the numbers, and if we get a detailed assessment like the one you've done, suggests that we should. And if it ever goes to appeal, and Inspect would rely presumably on the water cycle study, our water cycle study. They'll rely on the environmental impact assessments that these consultants have created. And again, there's very little room for us to overturn this. So, yeah, it is a worry that we can't, we could see developers, we could see developments that are going to have an adverse impact, but we can't do anything to stop them. And that's exactly the opposite of what we've tried to achieve. So there is a question here, and I guess I'm not quite sure what to do about that, but I'm very concerned about it. And I think my question to you as a hydrogeologist is, if you were in charge, what would you do? Is it about strengthening our policies so they make very specific recommendations on the limits of phosphates, of nitrogen in the water, so that developers don't have that wiggle room? Is it about lobbying government for policy? But we can do our best there, but we're not fully in control of that. Is it, do we need to look again almost at the water cycle study and in more detail in some of the regards that you described, to make sure that it's not used by developers as everything's going to be okay because the water companies will invest?
A quick comment, please.
What a good question.
Yeah, quick comment, please.
Taking it from the top, hopefully what I've done today is to raise awareness. Now, that's the first thing. We need to make people aware of that. I'll be very honest, you've got a very good officer here in Anne Shattuck, who is doing a great job at, and I know she's not a hydrogeologist herself, but she's doing a great job at learning about all this stuff, and hopefully she will know the sorts of questions to ask going forward on these sorts of things, and I hope that's the case. So, it is about having somebody who understands these things on your staff or within the boroughs to actually raise awareness of all these things. I agree, it's very difficult because the trouble is, I sat, as you know, as Vice Chair of the Development Control Committee at one point, and really you couldn't ask a lot of questions about the water companies and their role and was there availability of this or... And I know it's very difficult to actually put policies in place which should be the responsibility of the water companies to provide. It's very difficult to do that. But I would ask that, as either a committee or as a council here, we look at how far we can go on that and how far we can put conditions on water companies to perform in this area. Because if there's one reason for us being here as a council, sorry, I'm not a councillor anymore, but if there's one reason for this council being here, surely it's to help to protect the health, well-being and environment in which our constituents live. And I think it's a very important point. And I would encourage maybe a working finish group or something like that to try and to have a look at some of these issues now we've raised them.
Thank you, Mr. George. Okay, I've got. We need to be very quick and very concise with our questions because I've got 10 minutes, which include the answers. And already I've got Councillor McIntyre, Councillor Carruthers, okay, Councillor Laura James, and Councillor Cubitt. So after that, I won't be taking any more questions. No, I won't be taking any more questions. We're out of time. Okay, I'm sorry, Councillor Rattigan, I'm out of time. So Councillor McIntyre, please.
Why are we finishing so early tonight?
We've got a lot to go through. It doesn't end with the presentation. We have a lot to go through. So
what else is on the agenda?
we've also got the work plan to go through, but I want to move on. Okay, so Councillor McIntyre, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I hope that wasn't from my time allocation. Thank you very much, David, and I want to thank your colleague as well, Lawrence, for a very conclusive report, and most importantly for giving up your free time and coming and sitting here on a number of occasions and helping to educate us. I repeat what Councillor Tomlin has said. My learning curve of water hydrography and all that good stuff is certainly going up quite high, even though I'm still right at the bottom of that level. I'm going to be quite succinct here, and I'm going to focus on the so what, which is this last slide that you've got up here. There's a lot of very good, pertinent so what's there. The first one, the reduction of the total number of homes to be delivered on the basis of inadequate environmental capacity. Well, I think you're preaching to the converted. This committee has rejected the housing number. Our council has rejected our housing number. And I know Councillor Harvey will be very, very pleased to know that our council leader was on BBC South yesterday saying we need to slow down growth and that Basingstoke and Dean has built too much. So I think we're there. We're looking for that evidence to hang on. And I think this inadequate environmental capacity absolutely helps to feed into those exceptional circumstances for us. Rethinking the spatial strategy, so it's fantastic because in 4 days' time we're debating the spatial strategy. So that's something this committee can do and look in that and hopefully look to give recommendations. Rather than rattle through them all, I'm just going to focus on two now. And the two is going to be questions to our officers. And it's really about the, are these feasible? Can we put this into the plan? And the first one is competent scientific assessment of the impacts of the proposed changes to the wastewater treatment works, particularly phosphates, before committing to development, as recommended in the water cycle study. And the second one is implementation of a strategic Grampian clauses to situations where the water companies have not agreed revised discharge standards with the EA and provided the appropriate treatment technology. Question to our officers, is this feasible? Is this something we can put in place? If not, why not? Thank you.
Anne.
Thank you, I'll have a go at them. So regarding the first one, just to outline, going back slightly to what ACOM said about phosphates and why it wasn't included in the water cycle study, our reliance is very much on the river basin management plans to the Environment Agency to monitor water quality and it relative to the implementation of the Water Framework Directive. And the river basin management plan doesn't flag up phosphates. No, it doesn't flag up the wastewater treatment work being a problem in terms of phosphates. But when we met with the Whitchurch Conservation Group last week, we think that's a reasonable thing that we should be engaging with the Environment Agency and I think Southern Water to get a feeling of whether they think there is an issue. So it's not flagged up as an issue in the river basin management plan, but we would want to probe that a little bit more and to see if there has been any monitoring of the sort of contaminant flux that David George has referred to, and whether Southern Water do any monitoring of that we're not aware of, and whether the Environment Agency do. So that we see that we should be probing a bit more on that issue to see if there is an issue, and we're going to go back to the Environment Agency and work with the Whitchurch Conservation Group with their project on that. So I think that is something that, yes, that will be our starting point from that, and we'll see what their response is and if Southern Water have got information as well. Regarding the second point, I think probably the Environment Agency will review permits and decide on that. The issue is probably more likely to be the actual implementation of technology to achieve that. I'm not sure at the stage of the actual planning application that's very specific. I think we'll have to look into that further, really, to be honest, because that should have been agreed. From the revision of the permits, there's still the stage of implementing infrastructure. So to have a Grampian clause on that, there still could be quite a long time before infrastructure is implemented to meet the permit. So that might be too late in the day, to be honest. And I think the permit should have been agreed before then.
Thank you very much. Okay, Councillor Carruthers, please.
Thank you, Chair. Just to say, as everyone else has, thank you for a fantastic but also shocking report. I just listened to it and it's heartbreaking. Building on David's questions, focusing on the way forward, one of the suggestions was a policy specifically to protect the River Test. And I suppose my question is more of officers, is it possible to do this? And also,
we need it to be properly informed, not informed by the water cycle study and by the report by ACOM, but informed by the type of science that we've heard here tonight, that policy. So I suppose my question to officers is, what do we need to do as a council and as councillors to get that policy implemented to something that we're happy with and to get that included in our local plan?
Anne.
Thank you. I was slightly unclear about what the reference was to a policy for the Loddon, but not for the test, because that isn't the case at the moment. And in the new local plan update, there's proposed to be a policy that covers the river corridors of the Loddon, the test, and the Enbourne. So I wasn't quite clear what the reference was to it only applying to the Loddon, but we'd obviously welcome comments on that, and as part of the Reg 18 consultation, if there's any refinement needing to that proposed policy. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But if it needs refining to more specific areas of the test, we'd welcome that. I mean, there's quite a few policies in the local plan now that are relevant to the river test and the rivers generally in various forms. There's the water quality, biodiversity, green room structure, now the river corridors one. So there's quite a lot of policies that look at individual elements. So I suggest you have a look at the proposed river corridor policy and see if that meets the aspirations.
Thank you very much. Yes, certainly.
Thank you, Chair. Well, look, thank you for that information, but certainly it's probably because I'm no longer a councillor, I don't see all these documents coming through and what have you, but certainly the last revision I saw of the local plan purely had a specific policy for the Loddon and nothing for the test at all. So, in fact, I think it was headed Protection of the River Loddon or something like that, I can't remember. But certainly the last version of the local plan purely referred to Loddon, and it was a specific policy for the Loddon and not the test. Now that may have changed, but and I haven't seen those changes, but certainly that's the last version I saw, which was maybe 3 or 4 months ago now, something like that.
There was an early version that was just on the River Loddon, and then as a result of discussions at NAT and things, it was raised that why should it apply to the river test? So it was included, and our natural environment team was supportive of it, also covering the River Enbourne corridor. So.
Thank you very much, both. Okay. Councillor Laura James.
Thank you. So if we're saying tonight that we don't think that the water study is fit for purpose, and we will have lots of concerns, and Dave George has given us, a brilliant presentation tonight, and within that presentation he says that there's, the phosphates will cause significant harm to our river, and he says your presentation you said goodbye to our rivers. As part of my question, a very simple one I suppose is, if it is goodbye to our rivers, what does that actually mean? If we do destroy our rivers, what is the outcome of that ultimately if they're destroyed? I don't know what the ultimate outcome of that is. If we were to, in your presentation you gave the way forward, and I think they're brilliant, and what you say is that, however, before a draft local plan is submitted, the following may be considered. If we were to consider those, will that save those rivers? Is that something that you think will make a significant difference? What I want to know is, if we were then to consider them before we actually started looking at our spatial strategy, is that the way forward in relation to this? Is that what we should be doing? But so that's several questions within one, but also I really want to know what you mean by goodbye to our rivers. What is ultimately, if they're killed? Sorry? Well, I haven't finished my question yet.
Well, you've had several questions, so I'll come back.
Gosh, I don't think... Can I just say, I think this is amazing. I mean, we have an administration that was on the TV last night actually talking about their concerns about for this whole agenda. And then we have the administration tonight that is actually closing down democracy and timing us out. So you can't have it both ways. Either you're concerned or you're not. And there seems to be enormous fear about us actually having a debate in this chamber. It's incredible tonight, absolutely incredible. So I don't buy it. I don't buy last night that you actually are concerned as an administration, because if you were concerned, we would have an open debate here and be able to discuss some of these issues. But we're actually going to close this down at 8:30, and we're going to then discuss the plan for the rest of the year, which normally takes us as a committee about 5 minutes to discuss.
Councillor James, it's now 8:45. Okay, so it's not that at all. Basically, I have an agenda which I need to get through. Okay, and I need to get through it as efficiently as possible, which I am doing. So I'm also trying to give everybody a chance to actually make comment. Now, you've already interrupted and asked questions that are not through the chair, and I've let that go. Okay, and then you've sat there and you've asked 5 or 6 questions in a multiple. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to get answers for you first of all, okay, to some of those questions, and then we can move on. Okay. Mr. George.
Thank you, Councillor James. That's very, very interesting. Now, goodbye to our rivers sounds a bit of a hyperbole, I'll be very honest with you, but what does it mean? Well, I think the reality is you've got these gradings of rivers, and the trouble with phosphates is that, I don't know, we've got so much nitrate in the river, it's about twice the amount that's required under the European directive of 4 milligrams. We've got so much nitrate in there. It's a bit like having, but there's very little phosphate at all in the rivers getting in and what have you. And the trouble is that all the fish and higher life species and everything else require the river to be clean and what have you, and not a lot of algae and anything. And if you add just a very small extra amount of phosphate, these algae and everything love nitrate, but if they haven't got any phosphate, they can't grow. You put a little bit of phosphate in there and suddenly it blooms. And that's why you get algal blooms in the sea. The sea is voluminous, but you only need a very small amount of nutrient for it to go poof. And this is where you get the red tides and all these algal blooms. So it requires a very, very small amount of phosphate to create a chain reaction which basically starts off killing the higher life forms and the biota and what have you, fish. I'm sorry, I'm not an expert in this area, but, and you get these algal mats that tend to smother everything and the filamentous stuff. And so the river just becomes a shadow of its former self. In other words, it'll probably still support some life. Ducks will still swim on it and things like that, but you won't get the trout species, the fisheries will be affected. It'll possibly affect. We've got water voles now in Whitchurch, believe it or not, and things like that. So these species rely on a very, very clean river with not a lot of nutrient in. And once you put the phosphate in, you'll lose all these higher life forms and a lot of the plant species and everything else. And that's why, interestingly, they protected the itchin against phosphates because it's a special area of conservation, but they haven't protected the test, and we don't know why. And I don't know why, frankly. I have no idea why, because it's a triple SI. But at the end of the day, if we put that phosphate in, it will cause the river to degrade, and it will become, it certainly wouldn't be able to support the fisheries, and it certainly wouldn't be a beautiful place. You wouldn't be able to stand on the bridge and look down and see lots of trout and everything else. It just wouldn't happen, basically. It'd be a very different environment. And
excuse me, can you have questions to the chair, please? Can we just have questions to the chair, please, James?
I gave the question.
Sorry?
I gave the question. The question was about if I could ask.
In relation to the recommendations and your way forward, if we was to achieve that, particularly maybe even before we go out for a spatial strategy or discuss a spatial strategy, would we save those rivers? Is this our hope?
I think what we're up against here in lots of ways is the simplicity that is used to assess these situations. And this is brought out by the water cycle study. It's a very simple approach. I'm afraid across the board now, even Natural England seem to be using very broad brush, and even the Environment Agency use very broad brush, simple approaches. What we've got to do here is look at the detail of this before we fully understand the picture and what we can do about it. And at the moment, that's being done by these very broad approaches, which we seem to get from the Environment Agency about, well, it's all agricultural, so we can't do anything about it. The answer is, no, that's not correct. Look at this. You know, the one-dimensional approach. So by going in and doing these studies and what have you that are needed, we would understand the situation properly, we'd understand what the issues are. The reality is that if we can get very, very high-grade treatment for nitrates and phosphates on the water treatment works at Whitchurch, we could put further houses in the region. But given the approaches that are being taken at the moment, that is not going to happen. It's just not going to happen, and that's my real concern. So if we can achieve through this process, for example, the LERB and the Natural England guidance to include phosphates for the test, it would help tremendously. It really would help tremendously. But we haven't got that at the moment, and those are the sorts of things we've got to achieve, and we've got to have the evidence base, basically, to be able to inform these decisions and how we go forward. We've agreed, basically, with Basingstoke and Dean here, that as soon as we've finalised our documents and we get approval from Hampshire and Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust to release it, we will release that document to them to form part of the evidence base, so they can then use that to try and inform decisions and move things forward. I don't know whether that answers your question or not, but not really.
It was just in relation to all of those points you raised there. I welcome all of them really, and what I'm asking is, if we were to consider these all,
Thank you. You have more to say?
Well, I'd like to say thank you, but the idea of putting that forward was more of a discussion document. That was for you know, people to consider rather than being a definitive list. But so, you know, the committees and the members are, you know, the idea was to open up discussion on these things, but, you know, rather than being a definitive list.
Thank you, Mr. George. Okay, and finally, Councillor Cubitt, please.
So if I could just say thank you. I also want to say I feel very let down by the Basingstoke and Dean Borough Council and the technical study that we were given. And I have a couple of questions. In the local plan policy that we approved in 2016, and in the statement of common ground that was approved by the inspector, there was an obligation that the policy would be monitored by the Environment Agency, water companies and the council through a detailed monitoring plan to ensure compliance with the Water Framework Directive and the relevant river basin management plans. And the second bullet point of the approved local plan was that there would be a reporting of the annual monitoring undertaken by the Environment Agency and updates. None of this ever happened. And the reports that we got from the Environment Agency weren't even annual. So that was the approved plan that was approved by the inspector in 2016. So my question is not to Mr. George, who has been invaluable to us, and we're jolly lucky that we have had his time, but it is to the portfolio holder, Councillor Ganesh. I would like you to tell me how much we paid ACOM. I would like you to tell me whether you believe that we've been negligent corporately because we have failed to adhere to the implementation and monitoring undertakings that we made to the inspector in 2016. And I would also like you to advise us what you propose to do in light of the information that we've been given today. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. In terms of the the payments made and all that, I'll have to get back to you with the details if that's allowed with the council's policies. But as the cabinet member responsible for this entire process, I am conscious of the concerns that you all have, and I've been meeting with the parish councils and conservation groups and residents. So we all are concerned on the proposed housing need figure, and as a cabinet member responsible for the local plan, I will be supporting the officers if there's any sort of additional work needed, and if there's a way we can find out, say, if there's a way to find out, we can come up with a different or an alternative numbers or method to come up with a way forward with this local plan. I will work with the officers, and I am concerned with all the evidence that we have been collecting, and I have been talking to conservation groups and the parish councils, engaging with the officers regularly. So I share the concerns. I share the concerns that committee has. So I do work with officers to find a way out, and we have as a full council, as EPH, as a committee, you have refused in terms of the housing numbers. So we work with this very strict government, central government's the policy that we will have to adhere to. But if there's a way around to come up with a way to mitigate this, I will work with officers and ask for if there's any additional work needed that probably could help. I'm happy to. Thank you.
Ruth, did you want a reply?
I think it might be helpful because I just wanted to reflect on what we've been hearing tonight, maybe as a summary, just to try and capture some of what we've heard, which also might help. Dave George was unfortunately asked the question as to what we were going to do, and I appreciate you respectfully, left that for us to sort of get on with our job, really. There was lots to digest tonight, and it was really interesting, and thank you for your presentation. And I'm really also glad that we've got the slides, and we also have your phone number. So, and we know where you are, so it's not like you're getting away. Look, we welcome receiving the Whitchurch Group report once it's prepared, and that would be really helpful, so thank you for that. And would also welcome receiving the report from Stand Up for North Downs, which Councillor Connect referred to tonight. We also haven't seen that as officers either. These are all really good things because they help and contribute towards our evidence base, which is an evolving piece of work, as Dave George has mentioned already. We are working, and we have already expressed that we do intend to work with the Environment Agency in relation to a way forward with some of these, I'm going to say, starting points and some of the points which have already been raised and discussed tonight. I think you just need to let us capture that and take that away. I can't give you any, certainty in undertakings on things which aren't within our gift. Really looking forward to supporting Councillor Ganesh with his representations to DLUC in relation to, some of the issues that you've raised here tonight, not just the letter and the suggestions around the bill. You've all raised a question of trust and likelihood of that being actually able to be delivered, and also really you've challenged in a way the water cycle study methodology, which is actually a government set methodology as well, and in much of the discussion here tonight. So there's probably a number of themes and threads which we'll be able to support Councillor Ganesh on, including the point around phosphates, which Dave George has already mentioned here. So that's a piece of work that we're also taking away, and this is actually about a piece of evolving evidence. So, I appreciate that you're questioning our procurement process around who we've procured and what we've procured. So that's a set of questions, Councillor Cubitt, that we have to take away and provide in writing or come back to you on. I can't answer questions around costs and support the portfolio holder with those answers here tonight, but those are things that we can capture, subsequent to the meeting. I think that those are all of the, I'll say, actions that I've picked up. for the purpose of the record and the minute. I just wanted to sort of capture those in relation to this informative evening, and I hope that's helped.
Thank you. Just
yeah. That's not us, that's the Environment Agency, and that's the point I wanted to come back to you on. I appreciate it's in the local plan, but...
Just one thing, Councillor Cubic, very quickly.
Yeah, sorry. In the statement of common ground, which I don't have today, but I do have a copy at home, I recall that there was an undertaking on our part, together with, and it states in the local plan that was approved in 2016, the Environment Agency, the water companies and the council, through a detailed monitoring plan to ensure compliance. Interestingly, in the local plan update, somebody, certainly not a member, has removed that. And so going forward, if this local plan update is approved, it is now exclusively the Environment Agency that will be providing data for the Water Framework Directive. So there's obviously a problem because somebody's chosen to change the policy, but we haven't approved that yet. And I certainly won't approve us deviating from our original commitment because it weakens our water quality policy, not strengthens it.
Thank you very much. So just to kind of wrap up this part of the session, and sorry, I beg your pardon. It was a statement. Ruth?
I'd like to get back to you on that issue around the Statement of Common Ground and the Environment Agency. That's obviously, a point that's been raised that we need to capture properly following the meeting. So that's fine, we've got that on the list.
Thank you, committee. Okay. Obviously, I'm just trying to get the recommendations out of the committee, and Ruth's done a sterling job there of capturing everything. First of all, I just want to ask, is the committee happy with the work that's to be done by officers? Okay. Is there anything else? Okay. Do we want to make a recommendation to the cabinet that there are other streams of work that need to be done? For example, the way forward. Councillor James.
I'd like to pick up on the way forward, and I know that Dave George has said they were just discussion points, but I think there seems to be a consensus that we welcome those, and I think they should form a recommendation from this committee in relation to the work of this local plan.
Councillor Konecki behind you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Konesko.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I'd echo that as well, particularly the points around further scientific assessment of the impact, because I think that seems to be an area where there is some discrepancy between what the water cycle study says and what the experts have told us this evening. I think also, if I'm sensing this correctly, I'm sure the members will speak for themselves if they disagree, there is a lot of concern about the actual deliverability of what's needed for these upgrades. We've spent a lot of time discussing that this evening, and again, some further investigation into actually what this means and how deliverable it is, I think will probably give us some more comfort, because at the moment I'm sensing there's very little belief in any of this actually happening. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So just to be clear, okay, the committee wishes... Sorry, Councillor Tomlin.
Sorry, just on that, I'd like it clarified, or that we're aware that the head of planning did comment that the water cycle study was the government improved method that we should go through. Now that gives me great concern that we've just shot it to pieces, and how we've got to pick those pieces up to be able to challenge that we think we have an issue, or we talked about an exceptional circumstance, contrary to the government slamming us down, saying, well, you're looking too deeply into the subject. That's what worries me.
Thank you, Councillor Tomlin. What I was going to do to say that this committee, with your approval, makes the recommendation to the Cabinet that they look at the way forward here, okay, and look to commission pieces of work, okay, for further study, and to allow officers to actually do that. Councillor Cubitt.
I would support that. I think it's invaluable. I also think that SS4 needs to be strengthened so that when it is identified that infrastructure is required, that we apply SS4 until we are given a date, an expenditure and a time of completion of that infrastructure that is required in order to ensure no further deterioration either of the test or of the Loddon.
Thank you very much. Okay, so do we have general agreement here? Yes. Yes, okay. Thank you very much. Okay, so what are the... Sorry, Councillor McCormick.
Aligned with that, craving the indulgence of yourself and the committee, there's an implicit assumption in sections 3.5 and 3.6 that Thames Water and Southern Water as disposal authorities and South East Water and Southern Water as demand and supply authorities, everything is in hand, but that's at variance with what's being discussed tonight. Would the committee like to make that point to Cabinet, that we should take what the water companies are saying with a dose of salt?
Is the committee in agreement with that? Yes? Okay, we'll add that to the recommendations as well. Okay, so let's move on. Okay, so thank you very much, Mr. George, for your presentation. It's much appreciated, and thank you for sharing it early with us as well. Okay, so we could all have a detailed study of it. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so I'd like to move on. Okay, within the paper, we have Appendix 1, which contains effectively the questions that members made with the relevant technical answers and responses. So I'm not anticipating any questions or comments on there. Okay, Appendix 2. Excuse me, Public Gallery, can you? It's one meeting, please. Okay, so Appendix 2 contains the synopsis of Mr. George's presentation, and I think that's been covered earlier in the presentation in part number 5. And then moving on to Appendix 3, we have a letter or an email from the Department of Levelling Up. Does anybody wish to make any comment on that letter? No? Okay. So, looking at the fact that we've had a presentation from Mr. George regarding his views on behalf of the Whitchurch Town Council. 2, we've received the track changes to policies, okay, which were in the previous meeting. Okay, we've looked at the water cycle study, and we had the ACOM presentation on the 18th of July. Okay, and members have had additional opportunity to send in written questions, and get technical responses in writing. We've looked at the transport impact report review, okay, and officers have met with the Whitchurch Conservation Group. So as chair, I'm satisfied that the terms of the motion made in the meeting of this committee in June have been satisfied. Okay, so let's finally move on to the work programme. Councillor Cubitt.
Yes, Mr. Chair, would you like to advise us when we as members will be able to talk about track changes on the non-social strategy policy, because there is very significant changes. I've alluded to a few of them tonight, but there are numerous ones. And I think it is only fair that as members, significant amendments to the local planning policies that the agency inspectors approved policies of 2016, including those failures to adhere to them, such as
okay.
Now are significantly important, and that we as members have a chance to discuss the track changes.
Thank you, Councillor Cubitt. I'd like to invite you to put those questions in writing. Okay, if you put me on copy, we'll make sure that officers respond to them and get them circulated around the committee. Thank you.
I would like to know what other members think. I spent an enormous amount of time raising questions with regards to the water cycle study, and I actually don't think it's extremely fair to require of us, the members, to go through in detailed writing questions which then get ignored. The original amendments engendered a huge number of responses from a small committee of people that were allowed to make comments on the policy changes, and I haven't seen a document which says, yes, we've accepted that comment from that member, and no, we haven't accepted that comment from that member. And so now to say to me, as just one member, send me in the comments when we've already been through this process various times, I don't think is a very satisfactory way to undertake democracy. I actually think that we need, as we did before in 2014, we need a meeting at which EPH members discuss each of the policies separately to discuss whether we like the word wherever possible, inserted left, right and flipping Wales centre, and proportionate. QC is going to have a great deal of fun with the word proportionate, and I don't think questions written by me will meet that level of scrutiny that I think we are entitled to as political representatives.
Thank you, Councillor Cubitt. Ruth, how would you like to handle that?
I think that just for the public record, just in case someone's listening who isn't aware of everything that we've been doing over the last 18 months, it's important to explain that we started the local plan update process by undertaking a review on the adopted local plan policies and worked on new policies with members, as Councillor Cubitt's mentioned, and that led to, in March of this year, an EPH meeting where the proposed policies and updated policies were part of that agenda. And there have been, lots of comments from all members in relation to those policies. And, it's a fair enough comment because we've had so many versions as we've been building on those comments that it might be a question that people have in relation to, well, where was my comment? Was that comment adopted or not? So what we've been working on as officers is a piece of work which is a You Said We Did piece around some of those policies, which we were hoping to be able to include as part of our work that we've been doing with members that we have to compile in terms of preparing the draft local plan. And we were actually, like, when we provided those track changes comments via email, which I did in August, I was fully aware and expecting that some of you would wonder whether your comments following the number of different exchanges that we had over last year, as well as at EPH earlier this year, whether they were adopted or not. So I was sort of expecting some form of engagement prior to this evening, which I didn't receive any questions. What I had discussed with officers is that you do need to bear in mind that any Reg 18 consultation, which I appreciate none of you wish to do, but any Reg 18 consultation was going to provide an opportunity for an actual process to have consultation on those draft policies. All of you as members, as well as residents across the borough, would be able to make comments on those policies, which would be actually logged on the consultation system, which we would need to actually address and respond to as part of that evolution on the policies. You have to bear in mind that we actually had a number of, exchanges by email with all of the members, getting to the point that we have the draft policies with the track changes which we've provided you. The process of preparing a draft local plan just to get to this Reg 18 consultation means we have a set of policies. You might be questioning whether they're acceptable or not acceptable, but until they go out for a public consultation, we haven't, you've got to actually create a benchmark that you can go out and consult on, because otherwise we get a whole range of views from all of you as to, in relation to which bits and pieces are or are not, liked. The permissive language in the policies, which many of you have raised, I expect will actually come up as part of the legal review, which we won't be doing until we actually get closer to, finalising some of the plan. So, we can keep looking at policies, but you're just never going to actually get to the point of having a draft local plan if we did that, bearing in mind that the government's proposals with respect to the bill is that there would be a national set of these policies. And so rather than actually waiting for the government to implement a national set of policies, actually having our locally derived and shaped ones, I thought would be a stronger way going forward. So, we have passed the process of policy work. We're trying to get to the point of discussing the spatial strategies so we can compile all of this and actually move forward with some consultation and comment and, you know, public, you know, scrutiny through that process.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ruth. I mean, firstly, I'd like it on public record that there were a number of members that were excluded from that piece of work, and I put a formal complaint into the Chief Executive because I personally was excluded. Secondly, I believe that under the government guidance that the policies only need to be amended in the event that it transpired that they demonstrated that they were not working under the local plan approval of 2016. In fact, what we've gone and done is we seem to have rewritten an inordinate amount of policies that weren't failing to be, weren't failing. We've just amended them. And not only do we seem to have just amended them, but we seem to have weakened them. And I don't understand, because I believed when I read the government guidelines that the policies that were to be amended, it's not an obligation to amend all of them. They were only supposed to be those amended that were not fulfilling the annual monitoring report, and furthermore, they were not supposed to be weakened. They were supposed to be strengthened. When you insert words like wherever possible or proportionate, that is clearly a weakening of a policy. So I don't quite understand how that language got into the policies. Moreover, and just finally, Mr. Chairman, in the example that I cited with regards to the water quality, so I've had the hard copy printed of the non-spatial policies, which were supposed to be track change for amendments, and lo and behold, the policy document, which I made reference to earlier, which has the implementation and monitoring box, the policy will be monitored. There's been significant changes, but there's no track change amendment. So if I were to look at that clean without cross-referencing, which I spend my entire life doing because I don't trust the system, I've been proven right not to trust the system because there are no track changes implying there's a change to that box, and lo and behold, there's a significant change, and had I not bothered to cross-reference, I would not have been privy to that. And that makes me jolly concerned and very frightful and fearful that the non-spatial policies track changes are to be trusted.
Thank you, Councillor Cubitt. Ruth?
That was a statement, so there's nothing more for me to say.
Thank you, Chair. Well, it's just to add some fact to what Councillor Cubitt has just said. I was on the original MAP panel, not a member of EPH at the time, way back in November, and went through loads of the initial policies, rafts of these policies, made several comments where we saw, or I saw changes to unnecessary changes, the language, all sorts of comments, and I remember now that review was going to be summed up by the, at that time, portfolio holder, who then shut the process down. This was all on Zoom and whatever. And then in March, as a visiting councillor, I did present that the policies that we had seen, made the comments and had the comments tabulated and sent back to us. There were about 90% at least were, not dismissed. There was an argument put up, but basically the success rate of a number of councillors who contributed to this did not seem to, frustratingly, justify the effort put in. One likes to see some sort of debate, and having it shut down in the way it was done, I think we're now in a situation where we've not taken that on board since. There's an awful lot more policies, and we're busy to get on with the spatial strategy and park that. And I think some of our comments were quite constructive, and I'm very disappointed that not so many more of them were taken on board for very valid reasons. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Tomlin. Ruth?
I just wanted to painfully go back to a point that I make, that I know you must all groan when I say it, but the difference between what you went through in us getting to the point that we had a draft set that we could actually take to an EPH meeting and a Reg 18 is your comments on a Reg 18 are logged, they're on a consultation system, they all have to be tracked and followed through, and your concern that you've raised, that there's a concern that you've made comments and they've not been taken through, or that you've got issues that you wish to raise, that's the benefit of a Reg 18, because you'd be able to do that in a very public way. In terms of what we've been able to do as officers, we have worked with you all as a member group to review those policies and to get updates on them. And what those updates relate to is changes in government guidance, policy and the national position, because you have to bear in mind that some of those existing local plan policies, while they may not be that old in terms of our current local plan, there is further guidance that's been shaped, or the position has changed or been enhanced nationally in relation to some of those topic areas, which is why we have to update the policies, because the next local plan is actually going to take us, further forward into 2039, and policies that were written in, 2014 aren't necessarily going to be fit for purpose in 2039. So it's really important to actually capture and make sure we've updated everything as much as we can going forward, rather than thinking that a saved policy that was drafted back in 2014 is fit for purpose.
I've got you, Councillor Cubitt, but I've got Councillor James before you.
For me, I've always said that I think the policies are really fundamental to this local plan, and I've had real concerns about many of the policies. We did a lot of work in relation to our representation and what we sent in, and individually I did work as well as a member of the committee, but I think they're fundamental in relation to how we move forward. What I'd like to understand now, that then, if we are where we are, what happens, and as a committee, how do we now continue to work on these policies, at what stage, and when will they come back to us again, and for us to look at this again? Because I just think for us, as the policy aspect of the spatial strategy is fundamental.
Thank you for your comments there, Councillor James.
Okay, so there are two types of policies that you're talking about, I think, in your question. I just want to clarify. We've been talking about the development management policies and those broader policies that are non-spatial in relation to all of the track changes. The actual agenda for Monday of next week, which is the adjourned agenda, has the spatial policies in it. So looking at those two things differently. In relation to the development management policies, what would actually happen is, following a Reg 18 consultation, we would be capturing those changes and having to actually look at those in terms of how the local plan would evolve and be shaped, and EPH would be part of any post-consultation shaping anyway. That's not something that you don't get sight of again, because at the end of the day, that final plan for submission actually has to be agreed by full council. So you do actually all, have a role in relation to how it travels forward further from, anything that gets completed as a draft plan. In terms of the spatial policies, you're yet to debate those. You're going to do that hopefully on Monday.
In relation to the management policies?
What I think we want as a committee is a commitment that we will have some more quality time to discuss those on the work programme. I think that's fundamental.
Can I just ask you, please, just to put your questions through the chair, please, rather than just dive in and go through. Please, just continue. But in future, but in future, if you come through the chair,
it's fundamental that we look at those management policies after the Reg 18, and that are on the work programme. And I don't want what happened to us before. And Onali is right. It was an appalling process, and I just, on the record, want to say, as we've been said tonight, it was awful, and how we were treated as members, and it's similar to what's happening here tonight, but it was really bad in those MAP meetings, really bad. So what I want to do is have a process that we can really have it recorded as a work programme item, and we spend some detail once they come back. And will that happen, Chair?
Ruth.
I look forward to getting to the position that we post a Reg 18 consultation where I can help to influence an EPH work programme, which will include those pieces of work.
Thank you very much. And finally, okay, Councillor Cubitt. No, just hold on. Finally, because if we go beyond 5 minutes, I do need to suspend standing orders.
I'm sorry, my cheat quip is to Ruth because she said our policies relate to 2014 and yet we're being asked to consider population projections and housing needs based on 2014. That wasn't my central point. That was a cheap quip. I'm sorry for that. But my central point is that I believe that as a committee, we as a group would be much more successful at representing our residents, producing much better policies than just being treated like all consultees with little annotations on huge landscape documents where this is what X said and Y said and refuted or ignored or whatever. I think we as a group have shown in 2014, 2013 that we wrote some really good policies, and I think we have the ability to do that again. So I would absolutely agree with Councillor James. We should add it to your provisional work report that we discuss before Reg 18. And just finally, I'm not averse to Reg 18, and I don't think any councillors are averse to Reg 18. I think what a lot of councillors, I don't want to put words into their mouth, are averse to is proceeding with Reg 18 at a housing number that has been rejected outright by full council. Thank you.
Thank you, and that will be debated on Monday. Okay, that the housing number is mentioned. Okay, I'd just like to suspend standing orders. Okay, and go through to discuss the work programme. So we should easily be finished by 9:45. Do I have the committee's agreement on that? Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, right. So let's. So is that all the questions that we have? Okay, thank you very much. Okay, let's, officers, thank you. Okay, and now we'll just move on to the work programme. So committee, if we have a look, we can see that we've got obviously the 1st of September at the top, okay, which is tonight, and then on the 5th we have the local plan update, okay, to consider the spatial draft spatial. Sorry, I've got my wife's teeth in, obviously. The draft spatial strategy and the site-specific allocations prior to any Reg 18 consultation. And then moving forward onto the 3rd of November, we have Mark Lambert with the transport strategy, okay, which will provide an update on progress with transport. Then in January, we have the AMR, okay, and also in that, it's going to be a long evening there, we have the infrastructure delivery statement, okay, and at the moment that was kind of agreed by the chairman of Scrutiny, okay. It's going to be such a long evening that night, okay. I will look at splitting it out, but what I would like to do, yeah, I'll take that under advisement, okay, and see what I can do, okay. Councillor James, I've heard that. I've heard you. Okay, let me take that under advisement. Okay, and I will discuss that. We can discuss that in November. Okay, because there is plenty of time. Okay, I can also come back in the meantime. I've left the 2nd of March free for this particular time at the moment. Okay, because we've got three. Hold on, committee. We've got 3 papers. Okay, we've got 1, maintaining amenities and green spaces, which is a report in response to a council motion. Okay, then we have safety in high-rise residential buildings, and then we also have the leisure park master plan. Okay, so you know, whilst I'm not averse to holding or splitting the AMR and the infrastructure delivery statement, the issue we're going to have is timing. Okay, so we just need to have a think on that, okay, and then we can discuss that, you know, by the 3rd of November, okay, which will give people... Sorry, Councillor James, you had a finger raised.
So if we could put in some extra dates then, so that we can move that. Because I just think we've always said, as a committee, we wish to discuss the annual monitoring. It forms everything that we're about as a committee. Nothing else. That is our work. And we should spend some significant time on it and nothing else. So please ensure that we've got another date to move it.
I understand that, okay, and I have to say that when, just hold on, okay, it doesn't need to be a motion, okay, I will take that under advisement, okay, I was, because I personally think that the AMR, okay, should go to scrutiny, but I was overruled, okay, by the chair of scrutiny, and as he was basically fixing all our work plans and agreeing to our work plans, it was agreed that because we didn't have, unfortunately, that's the way that the new process is. Okay, is that the AMR, okay, and the infrastructure delivery statement were put on one evening at that particular time. Let me go away. Let me see if we can get some more dates. Okay, because the one thing that we don't have in reality. Hold on, Councillor Cubitt, let me finish, and then I'll come to you. Okay, in reality, we've already had a large number of adjourned meetings. Okay, so we need to get the work done. I appreciate the importance of the AMR, I really do, which is why, you know, I agreed to actually have it come to this committee. Okay, but we may need to have a long evening. Okay, if I can't get an extra date in there, just a warning shot. Councillor Cubitt.
So I would like to put forward a motion, and by the way, I think it's completely outrageous that anybody in the administration or the council suggests that the AMR should go to scrutiny. It's a nonsense. Actually, the AMR is central to EPH, and it's a document that is so important, I agree. Second, so I would like to put a motion forward that it happens when it happens. But secondly, the infrastructure delivery plan we haven't seen, right? And it is central to the local plan update. And I think to be given it on the 5th of January is unacceptable. I think we should be seeing the infrastructure delivery plan now. It should have actually been with us with the water cycle study and the transport study. So I think, firstly, I would like a motion that we have the annual monitoring report on the 5th of January on its own, because it encompasses everything. And secondly, I would like the infrastructure delivery statement to be discussed at a new meeting between the 5th of September and the end of December. Okay,
Hold on. Okay, Bruce.
I just thought it would be helpful to clarify, there's a typographical error in your work programme. The item which is on the 5th of January meeting is the infrastructure funding statement, the IFS, not the IDP, but I take on board the point that Councillor Cubitt's made, which is that the EPH committee haven't yet seen the infrastructure delivery plan, the IDP, which sits alongside the spatial strategy. And the reason why you haven't is that we were wanting to progress the spatial strategy conversation, I apologise members, from back in June, and you would have actually by now had the IDP if we were aware of that. And I can see that depending on how our work programme progresses, there might be a need for some form of paper in relation to the IDP. So I take on board the question that's been raised, and I wanted to take that away and look at our officer work programs, the stuff that we do to prepare for these agendas, following, well, basically following the summer leave when I'm able to actually clarify a few key points. So it's a good question. I'm happy to take it away, but they're two different things. Has everyone understood my clarification? Yeah, thank you.
So, sorry, Mr. Chairman, I would like to do a motion. I'd like a motion, and the motion is this. I would like us, the committee, to vote on securing a date to discuss the non-spatial strategies, 1, and 2, to discuss the infrastructure delivery programme before the end of 2022. Do I have anybody to say? On separate dates at an EPH scrutiny meeting before the end of 2022. Thank you. Yeah, so why, because, I mean, this is obviously not the verbiage for the motion, but why the infrastructure delivery plan, last one we had was in 2015, identified that Basingstoke and Deane had a shortfall of 199 million in its infrastructure. And I'm quite sure that with the additional 18,000 houses that we're currently proceeding with, the infrastructure delivery plan, I would imagine, is going to be significant, and 199 million might be what it is, or might be lower, might be higher, but we at the moment don't know what our infrastructure delivery plan shortfall is. That was a shortfall, 199 million, by the way. Secondly, with the non-spatial strategy, as I said, I believe that we collectively, Liberal Democrats, Labour, Independents and Conservatives, will together produce amendments to our local plan policies that are much better than just little bylines in, I don't know, typographical font 3 on a huge A3 next door to Mr. Bewley Holmes, Mr. Taylor Wimpey and Mr. Persimmons, and treated equally. I think that we have a right to be treated differently from such statutory consultees, and I believe that our views represent 8,000 residents each. We are entitled to discuss the amendments to the plan policy as a result.
Chair, future work programme, this committee or the council haven't reviewed SIL since 2018. We have inflation running at over 10%. With our current SIL levels, this vital projects could be losing money, and I think it's vital that this council reviews our SIL policies in the next 6 months.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Watts. I will take that on board and I'll discuss that with the Chair of Scrutiny, okay, and take it from there and report back. Thank you. Because under the actual rules of the Scrutiny Committee, of all the committees, the work programme has to be agreed, okay, with the Chair of Scrutiny. Okay, so I will take that away and I will speak to Tony and I will come back to the committee. Okay, if there are no more comments, I will then conclude that the meeting, okay, is finished at 21:35. Thank you very much, members.